Chapter 1, which treats of the character and pursuits of the famous gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha, in a village of La Mancha, the name of which I have no desire to call to mind. There lived not long since one of those gentlemen that keep a lance in the lance rack, an old buckler, a lean hack, and a greyhound for coursing, an olla of rather more beef than mutton, a salad on most nights, scraps on Saturdays, lentils on Fridays, and a pigeon or so extra on Sundays, made away with 3/4 of his income. The rest of it went in a doublet of fine cloth, and velvet breeches and shoes to match, for holidays, while on weekdays he made a brave figure in his best homespun. He had in his house a housekeeper past 40, a niece under 20, and a lad for the field and market-place, who used to saddle the hack as well as handle the bill-hook. The age of this gentleman of ours was bordering on 50. He was of a hardy habit, spare, gaunt-featured, a very early riser, and a great sportsman. They will have it his surname was Quixada or Quesada, for here there is some difference of opinion among the authors who write on the subject, although from reasonable conjectures it seems plain that he was called Quixana. This, however, is of but little importance to our tale. It will be enough not to stray a hair's breadth from the truth in the telling of it. You must know, then, that the above-named gentleman, whenever he was at leisure, which was mostly all the year round, gave himself up to reading books of chivalry with such ardor and avidity that he almost entirely neglected the pursuit of his field sports, and evening the management of his property, and to such a pitch did his eagerness and infatuation go that he sold many an acre of tillage land to buy books of chivalry to read, and brought home as many of them as he could get. But of all there were none he liked so well as those of the famous Feliciano de Silva's composition, for their lucidity of style and complicated conceits were as pearls in his sight, particularly when in his reading he came upon courtships and cartels, where he often found passages like "The reason of the unreason, with which my reason is afflicted, so weakens my reason that with reason I murmur at your beauty," or again, "The high heavens, that of your divinity divinely fortify you with the stars, render you deserving of the desert your greatness deserves." Over conceits of this sort the poor gentleman lost his wits, and used to lie awake striving to understand them, and worm the meaning out of them. What Aristotle himself could not have made out or extracted had he come to life again for that special purpose. He was not at all easy about the wounds which Don Belianis gave and took, because it seemed to him that, great as were the surgeons who had cured him, he must have had his face and body covered all over with seams and scars. He commended, however, the author's way of ending his book with the promise of that interminable adventure, and many a time was he tempted to take up his pen and finish it properly as is there proposed, which no doubt he would have done, and made a successful piece of work of it too, had not greater and more absorbing thoughts prevented him. Many an argument did he have with the curate of his village, a learned man, and a graduate of Sigenza, as to which had been the better knight, Pomeran of England or Amadis of Gaul. Master Nicholas, the village barber, however, used to say that neither of them came up to the knight of Phoebus, and that if there was any that could compare with him it was Don Galaor, the brother of Amadis of Gaul, because he had a spirit that was equal to every occasion, and was no finikin knight, nor lachrymose, like his brother, while in the matter of valor he was not a whit behind him. In short, he became so absorbed in his books that he spent his nights from sunset to sunrise, and his days from dawn to dark, poring over them, and what with little sleep and much reading his brains got so dry that he lost his wits. His fancy grew full of what he used to read about in his books: enchantments, quarrels, battles, challenges, wounds, wooings, loves, agonies, and all sorts of impossible nonsense, and it so possessed his mind that the whole fabric of invention and fancy he read of was true, that to him no history in the world had more reality in it. He used to say the Cid Dias was a very good knight, but that he was not to be compared with the knight of the burning sword who with one backstroke cut in half two fierce and monstrous giants. He thought more of Bernardo del Carpio, because at Roncesvalles he slew Roland in spite of enchantments, availing himself of the artifice of Hercules when he strangled Antaeus the son of Terra in his arms. He approved highly of the giant Morgante, because, although of the giant breed which is always arrogant and ill-conditioned, he alone was affable and well-bred. But, above all, he admired Reinaldos of Montalban, especially when he saw him sallying forth from his castle and robbing everyone he met, and when, beyond the seas, he stole that image of Mahomet which, as his history says, was entirely of gold, to have a bout of kicking at that traitor of a Gainlon he would have given his housekeeper and his niece into the bargain. In short, his wits being quite gone, he hit upon the strangest notion that ever madman in this world hit upon, and that was that he fancied it was right and requisite, as well for the support of his own honor as for the service of his country, that he should make a knight-errant of himself, roaming the world over in full armor and on horseback in quest of adventures, and putting in practice himself all that he had read of as being the usual practices of knights-errant, righting every kind of wrong, and exposing himself to peril and danger from which, in the issue, he was to reap eternal renown and fame. Already the poor man saw himself crowned by the May of his arm Emperor of Trebizond at least, and so, led away by the intense enjoyment he found in these pleasant fancies, he set himself immediately to put his scheme into execution. The first thing he did was to clean up some armor that had belonged to his great-grandfather, and had been for ages lying forgotten in a corner, eaten with rust and covered with mildew. He scoured and polished it as best he could, but he perceived one great defect in it, that it had no closed helmet, nothing but a simple morion. This deficiency, however, his ingenuity supplied, for he contrived a kind of half-helmet of pasteboard, which, fitted onto the morion, looked like a whole one. It is true that, in order to see if it was strong and fit to stand a cut, he drew his sword and gave it a couple of slashes, the first of which undid in an instant what had taken him a week to do. The ease with which he had knocked it to pieces disconcerted him somewhat, and to guard against that danger he set to work again, fixing bars of iron on the inside until he was satisfied with its strength, and then, not caring to try any more experiments with it, he passed it and adopted it as a helmet of the most perfect construction. He next proceeded to inspect his hack, which, with more quartos than a real and more blemishes than the steed of Gonella, that tantum pellis et ossa fuit, surpassed in his eyes the Bucephalus of Alexander or the Babiaca of the Cid. 4 days were spent in thinking what name to give him, because as he said to himself it was not right that a horse belonging to a knight so famous, and one with such merits of his own, should be without some distinctive name, and he strove to adapt it so as to indicate what he had been before belonging to a knight-errant, and what he then was, for it was only reasonable that, his master taking a new character, he should take a new name, and that it should be a distinguished and full-sounding one, befitting the new order and calling he was about to follow. And so, after having composed, struck out, rejected, added to, unmade, and remade a multitude of names out of his memory and fancy, he decided upon calling him Rocinante, a name, to his thinking, lofty, sonorous, and significant of his condition as a hack, before he became what he now was, the first and foremost of all the hacks in the world. Having got a name for his horse so much to his taste, he was anxious to get one for himself, and he was 8 days more pondering over this point, till at last he made up his mind to call himself Don Quixote, from where, as has been already said, the authors of this veracious history have inferred that his name must have been beyond a doubt Quixada, and not Quesada as others would have it, recollecting, however, that the valiant Amadis was not content to call himself curtly Amadis and nothing more, but added the name of his kingdom and country to make it famous, and called himself Amadis of Gaul. He, like a good knight, resolved to add on the name of his, and to style himself Don Quixote of La Mancha, by which, he considered, he described accurately his origin and country, and did honor to it in taking his surname from it. So then, his armor being furbished, his morion turned into a helmet, his hack christened, and he himself confirmed, he came to the conclusion that nothing more was needed now but to look out for a lady to be in love with. For a knight errant without love was like a tree without leaves or fruit, or a body without a soul. As he said to himself, if, for my sins, or by my good fortune, I come across some giant hereabouts, a common occurrence with knights errant, and overthrow him in one onslaught, or cleave him asunder to the waist, or, in short, vanquish and subdue him, will it not be well to have someone I may send him to as a present, that he may come in and fall on his knees before my sweet lady, and in a humble, submissive voice say, I am the giant Caraculi lord of the island of Malandrania, vanquished in single combat by the never sufficiently extolled knight Don Quixote of La Mancha, who has commanded me to present myself before your grace, that your highness dispose of me at your pleasure. Oh, how our good gentleman enjoyed the delivery of this speech, especially when he had thought of someone to call his lady. There was, so the story goes, in a village near his own a very good-looking farm girl with whom he had been at one time in love, though, so far as is known, she never knew it nor gave a thought to the matter. Chapter 2, which treats of the first sally the ingenious Don Quixote made from home. These preliminaries settled, he did not care to put off any longer the execution of his design, urged onto it by the thought of all the world, was losing by his delay, seeing what wrongs he intended to right, grievances to redress, injustices to repair, abuses to remove, and duties to discharge. So, without giving notice of his intention to anyone, and without anybody seeing him, one morning before the dawning of the day, which was one of the hottest of the month of July, he donned his suit of armor, mounted Rocinante with his patched-up helmet on, braced his buckler, took his lance, and by the back door of the yard sallied forth upon the plain in the highest contentment and satisfaction at seeing with what ease he had made a beginning with his grand purpose. But scarcely did he find himself upon the open plain, when a terrible thought struck him, one all but enough to make him abandon the enterprise at the very outset. It occurred to him that he had not been dubbed a knight, and that, according to the law of chivalry, he neither could nor ought to bear arms against any knight, and that evening if he had been, still he ought, as a novice knight, to wear white armor without a device upon the shield, until by his prowess he had earned one. These reflections made him waver in his purpose, but his craze being stronger than any reasoning, he made up his mind to have himself dubbed a knight by the first one he came across, following the example of others in the same case as he had read in the books that brought him to this pass. As for white armor, he resolved, on the first opportunity, to scour his until it was whiter than an ermine, and so comforting himself he pursued his way, taking that which his horse chose, for in this he believed lay the essence of adventures. Thus setting out, our new-fledged adventurer paced along, talking to himself and saying, who knows but that in time to come, when the veracious history of my famous deeds is made known, the sage who writes it, when he has to set forth my first sally in the early morning, will do it after this fashion. Scarce had the rubicund Apollo spread o'er the face of the broad spacious earth the golden threads of his bright hair, scarce had the little birds of painted plumage attuned their notes to hail with dulcet and mellifluous harmony the coming of the rosy dawn, that, deserting the soft couch of her jealous spouse, was appearing to mortals at the gates and balconies of the Manchegan horizon, when the renowned knight Don Quixote of La Mancha, quitting the lazy down, mounted his celebrated steed Rocinante and began to traverse the ancient and famous Campo de Montiel, which in fact he was actually traversing. Happy the age, happy the time, he continued, in which shall be made known my deeds of fame, worthy to be molded in brass, carved in marble, limned in pictures, for a memorial forever. And you, O sage magician, whoever you are, to whom it shall fall to be the chronicler of this wondrous history, forget not, I entreat you, my good Rocinante, the constant companion of my ways and wanderings. Soon he broke out, again, as if he were love-stricken in earnest. O Princess Dulcinea, lady of this captive heart, a grievous wrong have you done me to drive me forth with scorn, and with inexorable obduracy banish me from the presence of your beauty. O lady, deign to hold in remembrance this heart, your vassal, that thus in anguish pines for love of you. So he went on stringing together these and other absurdities, all in the style of those his books had taught him, imitating their language as well as he could, and all the while he rode so slowly and the sun mounted so rapidly and with such fervor that it was enough to melt his brains if he had any. Nearly all day he traveled without anything remarkable happening to him, at which he was in despair, for he was anxious to encounter someone at once upon whom to try the may of his strong arm. Writers there are who say the first adventure he met with was that of Puerto Lapis, others say it was that of the windmills, but what I have ascertained on this point, and what I have found written in the annals of La Mancha, is that he was on the road all day, and towards nightfall his hack and he found themselves dead tired and hungry, when, looking all around to see if he could discover any castle or shepherd's shanty where he may refresh himself and relieve his sore wants, he perceived not far out of his road an inn, which was as welcome as a star guiding him to the portals, if not the palaces, of his redemption, and quickening his pace, he reached it just as night was setting in. At the door were standing 2 young women, girls of the district as they call them, on their way to Seville with some carriers who had chanced to halt that night at the inn. And as happen what may to our adventurer, everything he saw or imaged seemed to him to be and to happen after the fashion of what he read of. The moment he saw the inn he pictured it to himself as a castle with its 4 turrets and pinnacles of shining silver, not forgetting the drawbridge and moat and all the belongings usually ascribed to castles of the sort. To this inn, which to him seemed a castle, he advanced, and at a short distance from it he checked Rocinante, hoping that some dwarf would show himself upon the battlements and by sound of trumpet give notice that a knight was approaching the castle. But seeing that they were slow about it, and that Rocinante was in a hurry to reach the stable, he made for the inn door and perceived the 2 gay damsels who were standing there, and who seemed to him to be 2 fair maidens or lovely ladies taking their ease at the castle gate. At this moment it so happened that a swineherd who was going through the stubbles collecting a drove of pigs for, without any apology, that is, what they are called, gave a blast of his horn to bring them together, and immediately it seemed to Don Quixote to be what he was expecting, the signal of some dwarf announcing his arrival, and so with prodigious satisfaction he rode up to the inn and to the ladies, who, seeing a man of this sort approaching in full armor and with lance and buckler, were turning in dismay into the inn, when Don Quixote, guessing their fear by their flight, raising his pasteboard visor, disclosed his dry dusty visage, and with courteous bearing and gentle voice addressed them, "Your ladyships need not fly or fear any rudeness, for that it belongs not to the order of knighthood which I profess to offer to anyone, much less to high-born maidens as your appearance proclaims you to be." The girls were looking at him and straining their eyes to make out the features which the clumsy visor obscured, but when they heard themselves called maidens, a thing so much out of their line, they could not restrain their laughter, which made Don Quixote wax indignant and say, "Modesty becomes the fair, and moreover laughter that has little cause is great silliness." This, however, I say not to pain or anger you, for my desire is none other than to serve you. The incomprehensible language and the unpromising looks of our cavalier only increased the lady's laughter, and that increased his irritation, and matters may have gone farther if at that moment the landlord had not come out, who, being a very fat man, was a very peaceful one. He, seeing this grotesque figure clad in armor that did not match any more than his saddle, bridle, lance, buckler, or corselet, was not at all indisposed to join the damsels in their manifestations of amusement, but, in truth, standing in awe of such a complicated armament, he thought it best to speak him fairly, so he said, Señor Caballero, if your worship wants lodging, baiting the bed, for there is not one in the inn, there is plenty of everything else here. Don Quixote, observing the respectful bearing of the alcayde of the fortress, for so innkeeper and inn seemed in his eyes, made answer, Sir Castellan, for me anything will suffice, for my armor is my only wear, my only rest the fray. The host fancied he called him Castellan because he took him for a worthy of Castile, though he was in fact an Andalusian, and one from the strand of Sanlúcar, as crafty a thief as Cacus, and as full of tricks as a student or a page. In that case, said he, your bed is on the flinty rock, your sleep to watch alway, and if so, you may dismount and safely reckon upon any quantity of sleeplessness under this roof for a 12 month, not to say for a single night. So saying, he advanced to hold the stirrup for Don Quixote, who got down with great difficulty and exertion, for he had not broken his fast all day, and then charged the host to take great care of his horse, as he was the best bit of flesh that ever ate bread in this world. The landlord eyed him over, but did not find him as good as Don Quixote said, nor evening half as good, and putting him up in the stable, he returned to see what may be wanted by his guest, whom the damsels, who had by this time made their peace with him, were now relieving of his armor. They had taken off his breastplate and backpiece, but they neither knew nor saw how to open his gorget or remove his makeshift helmet, for he had fastened it with green ribbons, which, as there was no untying the knots, required to be cut. This, however, he would not by any means consent to, so he remained all the evening with his helmet on, the drollest and oddest figure that can be imagined, and while they were removing his armor, taking the baggages who were about it for ladies of high degree belonging to the castle, he said to them with great sprightliness, Oh, never, surely, was there knight so served by hand of dame, as served was he, Don Quixote hight, when from his town he came, with maidens waiting on himself, princesses on his hack or Rocinante, for that lady's mine is my horse's name, and Don Quixote of La Mancha is my own, for though I had no intention of declaring myself until my achievements in your service and honor had made me known, the necessity of adapting that old ballad of Lancelot to the present occasion has given you the knowledge of my name altogether prematurely. A time, however, will come for your ladyships to command and me to obey, and then the may of my arm will show my desire to serve you. The girls, who were not used to hearing rhetoric of this sort, had nothing to say in reply. They only asked him if he wanted anything to eat. I would gladly eat a bit of something, said Don Quixote, for I feel it would come very seasonably. The day happened to be a Friday, and in the whole inn there was nothing but some pieces of the fish they call, in Castile, a badillo, in Andalusia, bacalao, and in some places, curadillo, and in others, troutlet. So they asked him if he thought he could eat troutlet, for there was no other fish to give him. If there be troutlets enough, said Don Quixote, they will be the same thing as a trout, for it is all one to me whether I am given 8 reals in small change or a piece of 8. Moreover, it may be that these troutlets are like veal, which is better than beef, or kid, which is better than goat. But whatever it be, let it come quickly, for the burden and pressure of arms cannot be borne without support to the inside. They laid a table for him at the door of the inn for the sake of the air, and the host brought him a portion of ill-soaked and worse-cooked stockfish, and a piece of bread as black and moldy as his own armor. But a laughable sight it was to see him eating, for having his helmet on and the beaver up, he could not with his own hands put anything into his mouth unless someone else placed it there, and this service one of the ladies rendered him. But to give him anything to drink was impossible, or would have been so had not the landlord bored a reed, and putting one end in his mouth poured the wine into him through the other, all which he bore with patience rather than sever the ribbons of his helmet. While this was going on there came up to the inn a sokelder, who, as he approached, sounded his reed pipe 4 or 5 times, and by that completely convinced Don Quixote that he was in some famous castle, and that they were regaling him with music, and that the stockfish was trout, the bread the whitest, the wenches ladies, and the landlord the castellan of the castle, and consequently he held that his enterprise and sally had been to some purpose. Chapter 3, where is related the droll way in which Don Quixote had himself dubbed a knight. Harassed by this reflection, he made haste with his scanty pothouse supper, and having finished it called the landlord, and shutting himself into the stable with him, fell on his knees before him, saying, "From this spot I rise not, valiant knight, until your courtesy grants me the boon I seek, one that will redound to your praise and the benefit of the human race." The landlord, seeing his guest at his feet and hearing a speech of this kind, stood staring at him in bewilderment, not knowing what to do or say, and entreating him to rise, but all to no purpose, until he had agreed to grant the boon demanded of him. "I looked for no less, my lord, from your high magnificence," replied Don Quixote, "and I have to tell you that the boon I have asked and your liberality has granted is that you shall dub me knight to-morrow morning, and that tonight I shall watch my arms in the chapel of this your castle. Thus, tomorrow, as I have said, will be accomplished what I so much desire, enabling me lawfully to roam through all the 4 quarters of the world, seeking adventures on behalf of those in distress, as is the duty of chivalry and of knights errant like myself, whose ambition is directed to such deeds." The landlord, who, as has been mentioned, was something of a wag, and had already some suspicion of his guest's want of wits, was quite convinced of it on hearing talk of this kind from him, and to make sport for the night he determined to fall in with his humor. So he told him he was quite right in pursuing the object he had in view, and that such a motive was natural and becoming in cavaliers as distinguished as he seemed and his gallant bearing showed him to be, and that he himself in his younger days had followed the same honorable calling, roaming in quest of adventures in various parts of the world, among others the curing grounds of Malaga, the Isles of Rairin, the precinct of Seville, the little market of Segovia, the Olivera of Valencia, the Rendilla of Granada, the Strand of Sanlúcar, the Colt of Cordova, the taverns of Toledo, and divers other quarters, where he had proved the nimbleness of his feet and the lightness of his fingers, doing many wrongs, cheating many widows, ruining maids and swindling minors, and, in short, bringing himself under the notice of almost every tribunal and court of justice in Spain, until at last he had retired to this castle of his, where he was living upon his property and upon that of others, and where he received all knights errant of whatever rank or condition they may be, all for the great love he bore them, and that they may share their substance with him in return for his benevolence. He told him, moreover, that in this castle of his there was no chapel in which he could watch his armor, as it had been pulled down in order to be rebuilt, but that in a case of necessity it may, he knew, be watched anywhere, and he may watch it that night in a courtyard of the castle, and in the morning, God willing, the requisite ceremonies may be performed so as to have him dubbed a knight, and so thoroughly dubbed that nobody could be more so. He asked if he had any money with him, to which Don Quixote replied that he had not a farthing, as in the histories of knights errant he had never read of any of them carrying any. On this point the landlord told him he was mistaken, for though not recorded in the histories, because in the author's opinion there was no need to mention anything so obvious and necessary as money and clean shirts. It was not to be supposed, therefore, that they did not carry them, and he may regard it as certain and established that all knights-errant about whom there were so many full and unimpeachable books carried well-furnished purses in case of emergency, and likewise carried shirts and a little box of ointment to cure the wounds they received. For in those plains and deserts where they engaged in combat and came out wounded, it was not always that there was someone to cure them, unless truly they had for a friend some sage magician to succor them at once by fetching through the air upon a cloud some damsel or dwarf with a vial of water of such virtue that by tasting one drop of it they were cured of their hurts and wounds in an instant, and left as sound as if they had not received any damage whatever. But in case this should not occur, the knights of old took care to see that their squires were provided with money and other requisites, such as lint and ointments for healing purposes, and when it happened that knights had no squires, which was rarely and seldom the case, they themselves carried everything in cunning saddlebags that were hardly seen on the horses' croup, as if it were something else of more importance, because, unless for some such reason, carrying saddlebags was not very favorably regarded among knights-errant, he therefore advised him, and as his godson so soon to be, he may evening command him never from that time forth to travel without money and the usual requirements, and he would find the advantage of them when he least expected it. Don Quixote promised to follow his advice scrupulously, and it was arranged immediately that he should watch his armor in a large yard at one side of the inn. So, collecting it all together, Don Quixote placed it on a trough that stood by the side of a well, and bracing his buckler on his arm he grasped his lance and began with a stately air to march up and down in front of the trough, and as he began his march night began to fall. The landlord told all the people who were in the inn about the craze of his guest, the watching of the armor, and the dubbing ceremony he contemplated. Full of wonder at so strange a form of madness, they flocked to see it from a distance, and observed with what composure he sometimes paced up and down, or sometimes, leaning on his lance, gazed on his armor without taking his eyes off it for ever so long. And as the night closed in with a light from the moon so brilliant that it may vie with his that lent it, everything the novice knight did was plainly seen by all. Meanwhile one of the carriers who were in the inn thought fit to water his team, and it was necessary to remove Don Quixote's armor as it lay on the trough. But he, seeing the other approach, hailed him in a loud voice, "O you, whoever you are, rash knight, that comest to lay hands on the armor of the most valorous errant that ever girt on sword, have a care what you do. Touch it not unless you wouldst lay down your life as the penalty of your rashness." The carrier gave no heed to these words, and he would have done better to heed them if he had been heedful of his health, but seizing it by the straps flung the armor some distance from him. Seeing this, Don Quixote raised his eyes to heaven, and fixing his thoughts, apparently, upon his lady Dulcinea, exclaimed, "Aid me, lady mine, in this the first encounter that presents itself to this breast, which you holdest in subjection. Let not your favor and protection fail me in this first jeopardy." And with these words and others to the same purpose, dropping his buckler, he lifted his lance with both hands, and with it smote such a blow on the carrier's head that he stretched him on the ground, so stunned that had he followed it up with a second there would have been no need of a surgeon to cure him. This done, he picked up his armor and returned to his beat with the same serenity as before. Shortly after this, another, not knowing what had happened, for the carrier still lay senseless, came with the same object of giving water to his mules, and was proceeding to remove the armor in order to clear the trough, when Don Quixote, without uttering a word or imploring aid from anyone, once more dropped his buckler and once more lifted his lance, and without actually breaking the second carrier's head into pieces, made more than 3 of it for he laid it open in four. At the noise all the people of the inn ran to the spot, and among them the landlord. Seeing this, Don Quixote braced his buckler on his arm, and, with his hand on his sword, exclaimed, "O Lady of beauty, strength and support of my faint heart, it is time for you to turn the eyes of your greatness on this your captive knight on the brink of so mighty an adventure." By this he felt himself so inspired that he would not have flinched if all the carriers in the world had assailed him. The comrades of the wounded, perceiving the plight they were in, began from a distance to shower stones on Don Quixote, who screened himself as best he could with his buckler, not daring to quit the trough and leave his armor unprotected. The landlord shouted to them to leave him alone, for he had already told them that he was mad, and as a madman he would not be accountable even if he killed them all. Still louder shouted Don Quixote, calling them knaves and traitors, and the lord of the castle, who allowed knights-errant to be treated in this fashion, a villain and a low-born knight whom, had he received the order of knighthood, he would call to account for his treachery. But of you, he cried, base and vile rabble, I make no account. Fling, strike, come on, do all ye can against me. Ye shall see what the reward of your folly and insolence will be. This he uttered with so much spirit and boldness that he filled his assailants with a terrible fear, and as much for this reason as at the persuasion of the landlord they left off stoning him, and he allowed them to carry off the wounded, and with the same calmness and composure as before resumed the watch over his armor. But these freaks of his guest were not much to the liking of the landlord, so he determined to cut matters short and confer upon him at once the unlucky order of knighthood before any further misadventure could occur. So, going up to him, he apologized for the rudeness which, without his knowledge, had been offered to him by these low people, who, however, had been well punished for their audacity. As he had already told him, he said, there was no chapel in the castle, nor was it needed, for what remained to be done, for, as he understood the ceremonial of the order, the whole point of being dubbed a knight lay in the accolade and in the slap on the shoulder, and that could be administered in the middle of a field, and that he had now done all that was needful as to watching the armor, for all requirements were satisfied by a watch of 2 hours only, while he had been more than 4 about it. Don Quixote believed it all, and told him he stood there ready to obey him, and to make an end of it with as much dispatch as possible, for if he were again attacked, and felt himself to be dubbed knight, he would not, he thought, leave a soul alive in the castle, except such as out of respect he may spare at his bidding. Thus warned and menaced, the castellan immediately brought out a book in which he used to enter the straw and barley he served out to the carriers, and with a lad carrying a candle end and the 2 damsels already mentioned, he returned to where Don Quixote stood and bade him kneel down. Then, reading from his account book as if he were repeating some devout prayer, in the middle of his delivery he raised his hand and gave him a sturdy blow on the neck, and then, with his own sword, a smart slap on the shoulder, all the while muttering between his teeth as if he was saying his prayers. Having done this, he directed one of the ladies to gird on his sword, which she did with great self-possession and gravity, and not a little was required to prevent a burst of laughter at each stage of the ceremony. But what they had already seen of the novice knight's prowess kept their laughter within bounds. On girding him with the sword, the worthy lady said to him, "May God make your worship a very fortunate knight, and grant you success in battle." Don Quixote asked her name and order, that he may from that time forward know to whom he was beholden for the favor he had received, as he meant to confer upon her some portion of the honor he had acquired by the may of his arm. She answered with great humility that she was called La Tolosa, and that she was the daughter of a cobbler of Toledo who lived in the stalls of Sancho Bienea, and that wherever she may be she would serve and esteem him as her lord. Don Quixote said in reply that she would do him a favor if thenceforward she assumed the Don and called herself Dona Tolosa. She promised she would, and then the other buckled on his spur, and with her followed almost the same conversation as with the lady of the sword. He asked her name, and she said it was La Molinera, and that she was the daughter of a respectable miller of Antequera, and of her likewise Don Quixote requested that she would adopt the Don and call herself Dona Molinera, making offers to her further services and favors. Having thus, with hot haste and speed, brought to a conclusion these never till now seen ceremonies, Don Quixote was on thorns until he saw himself on horseback sallying forth in quest of adventures, and saddling Rocinante at once he mounted, and embracing his host as he returned thanks for his kindness in knighting him, he addressed him in language so extraordinary that it is impossible to convey an idea of it or report it. Chapter 4 of what happened to our knight when he left the inn. Day was dawning when Don Quixote quitted the inn, so happy, so gay, so exhilarated at finding himself now dubbed a knight, that his joy was like to burst his horse girths. However, recalling the advice of his host as to the requisites he ought to carry with him, especially that referring to money and shirts, he determined to go home and provide himself with all, and also with a squire, for he reckoned upon securing a farm laborer, a neighbor of his, a poor man with a family, but very well qualified for the office of squire to a knight. With this object he turned his horse's head towards his village, and Rocinante, thus reminded of his old quarters, stepped out so briskly that he hardly seemed to tread the earth. He had not gone far, when out of a thicket on his right there seemed to come feeble cries as of someone in distress, and the instant he heard them he exclaimed, "Thanks be to heaven for the favor it accords me, that it so soon offers me an opportunity of fulfilling the obligation I have undertaken, and gathering the fruit of my ambition." These cries, no doubt, come from some man or woman in want of help, and needing my aid and protection. And wheeling, he turned Rocinante in the direction from where the cries seemed to proceed. He had gone but a few paces into the wood when he saw a mare tied to an oak, and tied to another, and stripped from the waist upwards, a youth of about 15 years of age, from whom the cries came, nor were they without cause, for a lusty farmer was flogging him with a belt and following up every blow with scoldings and commands, repeating, "Your mouth shut and your eyes open," while the youth made answer, "I won't do it again, master mine. By God's passion I won't do it again, and I'll take more care of the flock another time." Seeing what was going on, Don Quixote said in an angry voice, "Discourteous knight, it ill becomes you to assail one who cannot defend himself. Mount your steed and take your lance, for there was a lance leaning against the oak to which the mare was tied, and I will make you know that you are behaving as a coward." The farmer, seeing before him this figure in full armor brandishing a lance over his head, gave himself up for dead, and made answer meekly, "Sir Knight, this youth that I am chastising is my servant, employed by me to watch a flock of sheep that I have hard by, and he is so careless that I lose one every day, and when I punish him for his carelessness and knavery he says I do it out of niggardliness, to escape paying him the wages I owe him, and before God and on my soul he lies before me." "Base clown," said Don Quixote, "by the sun that shines on us I have a mind to run you through with this lance. Pay him at once, without another word. If not, by the God that rules us I will make an end of you, and annihilate you on the spot. Release him instantly." The farmer hung his head, and without a word untied his servant, of whom Don Quixote asked how much his master owed him. He replied, 9 months at 7 reals a month. Don Quixote added it up, found that it came to 63 reals, and told the farmer to pay it down immediately, if he did not want to die for it. The trembling clown replied that as he lived, and by the oath he had sworn, though he had not sworn any, it was not so much, for there were to be taken into account and deducted 3 pairs of shoes he had given him, and a real for 2 bloodlettings when he was sick. All that is very well, said Don Quixote, but let the shoes and the bloodlettings stand as a set-off against the blows you have given him, without any cause. For if he spoiled the leather of the shoes you paid for, you have damaged that of his body, and if the barber took blood from him when he was sick, you have drawn it when he was sound. So on that score he owes you nothing. The difficulty is, Sir Knight, that I have no money here. Let Andres come home with me, and I will pay him all, real by real. I go with him, said the youth. No, God forbid. No, senor, not for the world, for once alone with me, he would ray me like a Saint Bartholomew. He will do nothing of the kind, said Don Quixote. I have only to command, and he will obey me, and as he has sworn to me by the order of knighthood which he has received, I leave him free, and I guarantee the payment. Consider what you are saying, senor, said the youth. This master of mine is not a knight, nor has he received any order of knighthood, for he is Juan Haljudo the Rich, of Quintanar. That matters little, replied Don Quixote. There may be Haljudos, knights, moreover, ever one is the son of his works. That is true, said Andres, but this master of mine, of what works is he the son? When he refuses me the wages of my sweat and labor, I do not refuse. Brother Andres, said the farmer, be good enough to come along with me, and I swear by all the orders of knighthood there are in the world to pay you as I have agreed, real by real, and perfumed. For the perfumery I excuse you, said Don Quixote. Give it to him in reals, and I shall be satisfied, and see that you do as you have sworn. If not, by the same oath I swear to come back and hunt you out and punish you, and I shall find you though you should lie closer than a lizard. And, if you desire to know who it is lays this command upon you, that you be more firmly bound to obey it, know that I am the valorous Don Quixote of La Mancha, the undoer of wrongs and injustices, and so, God be with you, and keep in mind what you have promised and sworn under those penalties that have been already declared to you. So saying, he gave Rocinante the spur, and was soon out of reach. The farmer followed him with his eyes, and when he saw that he had cleared the wood and was no longer in sight, he turned to his boy Andres and said, Come here, my son, I want to pay you what I owe you, as that undoer of wrongs has commanded me. My oath on it, said Andres, your worship will be well advised to obey the command of that good knight. May he live 1,000 years, for, as he is a valiant and just judge, by roke, if you do not pay me, he will come back and do as he said. My oath on it, too, said the farmer, but as I have a strong affection for you, I want to add to the debt in order to add to the payment, and, seizing him by the arm, he tied him up again, and gave him such a flogging that he left him for dead. Now, Master Andres, said the farmer, call on the undoer of wrongs. You will find he won't undo that, though I am not sure that I have quite done with you, for I have a good mind to flay you alive. But at last he untied him, and gave him leave to go look for his judge in order to put the sentence pronounced into execution. Andres went off rather down in the mouth, swearing he would go to look for the valiant Don Quixote of La Mancha and tell him exactly what had happened, and that all would have to be repaid him sevenfold. But for all that he went off weeping, while his master stood laughing. Thus did the valiant Don Quixote right that wrong, and, thoroughly satisfied with what had taken place, as he considered he had made a very happy and noble beginning with his knighthood, he took the road towards his village in perfect self-content, saying in a low voice, Well mayest you this day call thyself fortunate above all on earth, O Dulcinea del Toboso, fairest of the fair, since it has fallen to your lot to hold, subject and submissive to your full will and pleasure, a knight so renowned, as is and will be Don Quixote of La Mancha, who, as all the world knows, yesterday received the order of knighthood, and has today righted the greatest wrong and grievance that ever injustice conceived and cruelty perpetrated. who has today plucked the rod from the hand of over there, ruthless oppressor so wantonly lashing that tender child. He now came to a road branching in 4 directions, and immediately he was reminded of those crossroads where knights errant used to stop to consider which road they should take. In imitation of them he halted for a while, and after having deeply considered it, he gave Rocinante his head, submitting his own will to that of his hack, who followed out his first intention, which was to make straight for his own stable. After he had gone about 2 miles, Don Quixote perceived a large party of people who, as afterwards appeared, were some Toledo traders on their way to buy silk at Murcia. There were 6 of them coming along under their sunshades, with 4 servants mounted and 3 muleteers on foot. Scarcely had Don Quixote descried them when the fancy possessed him that this must be some new adventure, and to help him to imitate as far as he could those passages he had read of in his books, here seemed to come one, made on purpose, which he resolved to attempt. So, with a lofty bearing and determination, he fixed himself firmly in his stirrups, got his lance ready, brought his buckler before his breast, and planting himself in the middle of the road, stood waiting the approach of these knights errant, for such he now considered and held them to be. And when they had come near enough to see and hear, he exclaimed with a haughty gesture, "All the world stand, unless all the world confess that in all the world there is no maiden fairer than the Empress of La Mancha, the peerless Dulcinea del Toboso." The traders halted at the sound of this language and the sight of the strange figure that uttered it, and from both figure and language at once guessed the craze of their owner. They wished, however, to learn quietly what was the object of this confession that was demanded of them, and one of them, who was rather fond of a joke and was very sharp-witted, said to him, "Sir Knight, we do not know who this good lady is that you speak of. Show her to us, for, if she be of such beauty as you suggest, with all our hearts and without any pressure we will confess the truth that is on your part required of us." "If I were to show her to you," replied Don Quixote, "what merit would you have in confessing a truth so manifest? The essential point is that, without seeing her you must believe, confess, affirm, swear, and defend it, else ye have to do with me in battle, ill-conditioned, arrogant rabble that ye are, and come ye on, one by one as the order of knighthood requires, or altogether as is the custom and vile usage of your breed. Here do I bide and await you, relying on the justice of the cause I maintain." "Sir Knight," replied the traitor, "I entreat your worship in the name of this present company of princes that, to save us from charging our consciences with the confession of a thing we have never seen or heard of, and one moreover so much to the prejudice of the empresses and queens of the Alcaria and Estremadura, your worship will be pleased to show us some portrait of this lady, though it be no bigger than a grain of wheat, for by the thread one gets at the ball, and in this way we shall be satisfied and easy, and you will be content and pleased. No, I believe we are already so far agreed with you that evening though her portrait should show her blind of one eye, and distilling vermilion and sulphur from the other, we would nevertheless, to gratify your worship, say all in her favor that you desire." "She distills nothing of the kind, vile rabble," said Don Quixote, burning with rage. "Nothing of the kind, I say, only ambergris and civet in cotton. Nor is she one-eyed or humpbacked, but straighter than a Guadarrama spindle. But ye must pay for the blasphemy ye have uttered against beauty like that of my lady." And so saying, he charged with levelled lance against the one who had spoken, with such fury and fierceness that, if luck had not contrived that Rocinante should stumble midway and come down, it would have gone hard with the rash traitor. Down went Rocinante, and over went his master, rolling along the ground for some distance, and when he tried to rise he was unable, so encumbered was he with lance, buckler, spurs, helmet, and the weight of his old armor, and all the while he was struggling to get up he kept saying, "Fly not, cowards and catists, stay, for not by my fault, but my horse's, am I stretched here." one of the muleteers in attendance, who could not have had much good nature in him, hearing the poor prostrate man blustering in this style, was unable to refrain from giving him an answer on his ribs, and coming up to him he seized his lance, and having broken it in pieces with one of them he began so to belabor our Don Quixote that, notwithstanding and in spite of his armor, he milled him like a measure of wheat. His masters called out not to lay on so hard and to leave him alone, but the muleteer's blood was up, and he did not care to drop the game until he had vented the rest of his wrath, and gathering up the remaining fragments of the lance he finished with a discharge upon the unhappy victim, who all through the storm of sticks that rained on him never ceased threatening heaven and earth and the brigands, for such they seemed to him. At last, the muleteer was tired, and the traders continued their journey, taking with them matter for talk about the poor fellow who had been cudgeled. He, when he found himself alone, made another effort to rise, but if he was unable when whole and sound, how was he to rise after having been thrashed and well near knocked to pieces? And yet he esteemed himself fortunate, as it seemed to him that this was a regular knight-errant's mishap, and entirely, he considered, the fault of his horse. Chapter 5, in which the narrative of our knight's mishap is continued. Finding, then, that, in fact, he could not move, he thought himself of having recourse to his usual remedy, which was to think of some passage in his books, and his craze brought to his mind that about Baldwin and the Marquis of Mantua, when Carloto left him wounded on the mountain side, a story known by heart by the children, not forgotten by the young men, and lauded and evening believed by the old folk, and for all that not a whit truer than the miracles of Mahomet. This seemed to him to fit exactly the case in which he found himself, so, making a show of severe suffering, he began to roll on the ground and with feeble breath repeat the very words which the wounded knight of the wood is said to have uttered. Where are you, lady mine, that you my sorrow do not rue? You cannot know it, lady mine, or else you are untrue. And so he went on with the ballad as far as the lines, O noble Marquis of Mantua, mine uncle, and liege lord. As chance would have it, when he had got to this line there happened to come by a peasant from his own village, a neighbor of his who had been with a load of wheat to the mill, and he, seeing the man stretched there, came up to him and asked him who he was and what was the matter with him, that he complained so dolefully. Don Quixote was firmly persuaded that this was the Marquis of Mantua, his uncle, so the only answer he made was to go on with his ballad, in which he told the tale of his misfortune, and of the loves of the emperor's son and his wife, all exactly as the ballad sings it. The peasant stood amazed at hearing such nonsense, and relieving him of the visor, already battered to pieces by blows, he wiped his face, which was covered with dust, and as soon as he had done so he recognized him, and said, Senor Quixada, for so he appears to have been called when he was in his senses, and had not yet changed from a quiet country gentleman into a knight-errant, who has brought your worship to this pass? But to all questions the other only went on with his ballad. Seeing this, the good man removed as well as he could his breastplate and backpiece to see if he had any wound, but he could perceive no blood nor any mark whatever. He then contrived to raise him from the ground, and with no little difficulty hoisted him upon his ass, which seemed to him to be the easiest mount for him, and collecting the arms, evening to the splinters of the lance, he tied them on Rocinante, and leading him by the bridle and the ass by the halter, he took the road for the village, very sad to hear what absurd stuff Don Quixote was talking. Nor was Don Quixote less so, for what with blows and bruises he could not sit upright on the ass, and from time to time he sent up sighs to heaven, so that once more he drove the peasant to ask what ailed him, and it could have been only the devil himself that put into his head tales to match his own adventures, for now, forgetting Baldwin, he bethought himself of the more Abindaries, when the Alcade of Antequera, Rodrigo de Narvaez, took him prisoner and carried him away to his castle, so that, when the peasant again asked him how he was and what ailed him, he gave him for reply the same words and phrases that the captive Abindaries gave to Rodrigo de Narvaez, just as he had read the story in the Diana of Jorge de Montemayor, where it is written, applying it to his own case so aptly that the peasant went along cursing his fate that he had to listen to such a lot of nonsense, from which, however, he came to the conclusion that his neighbor was mad, and so made all haste to reach the village to escape the wearisomeness of this harangue of Don Quixote's, who, at the end of it, said, "Senor Don Rodrigo de Narvaez, your worship must know that this fair Zarifa I have mentioned is now the lovely Dulcinea del Toboso, for whom I have done, am doing, and will do the most famous deeds of chivalry that in this world have been seen, are to be seen, or ever shall be seen." To this the peasant answered, "Sinner, sinner that I am, cannot your worship see that I am not Don Rodrigo de Narvaez nor the Marquis of Mantua, but Pedro Alonso your neighbor, and that your worship is neither Baldwin nor Abindaries, but the worthy gentleman Senor Quixada?" "I know who I am," replied Don Quixote, "and I know that I may be not only those I have named, but all the 12 peers of France, and evening all the 9 worthies, since my achievements surpass all that they have done, altogether, and each of them on his own account." With this talk and more of the same kind they reached the village just as night was beginning to fall, but the peasant waited until it was a little later, that the belabored gentleman may not be seen riding in such a miserable trim. When it was what seemed to him the proper time, he'd entered the village and went to Don Quixote's house, which he found all in confusion, and there were the curate and the village barber, who were great friends of Don Quixote, and his housekeeper was saying to them in a loud voice, "What does your worship think can have befallen my master, Senor Licentiate Piero Perez?" For so the curate was called. "It is 3 days now since anything has been seen of him, or the hack, or the buckler, lance, or armor. Miserable me, I am certain of it, and it is as true as that I was born to die, that these accursed books of chivalry he has got into the way of reading so constantly have upset his reason. For now I remember having often heard him saying to himself that he would turn knight errant and go all over the world in quest of adventures. To the devil and Barabbas with such books that have brought to ruin in this way the finest understanding there was in all La Mancha." The niece said the same and more. "You must know Master Nicholas, for that was the name of the barber. It was often my uncle's way to stay 2 days and nights together poring over these unholy books of misadventures, after which he would fling the book away and snatch up his sword and fall to slashing the walls. And when he was tired out he would say he had killed 4 giants like 4 towers, and the sweat that flowed from him when he was weary, he said, was the blood of the wounds he had received in battle, and then he would drink a great jug of cold water and become calm and quiet, saying that this water was a most precious potion which the sage Esquif, a great magician and friend of his, had brought him. But I take all the blame upon myself for never having told your worships of my uncle's vagaries, that you may put a stop to them before things had come to this pass, and burn all these accursed books, for he has a great number that richly deserve to be burned like heretics. "So say I too," said the curate, "and by my faith tomorrow shall not pass without public judgment upon them, and may they be condemned to the flames, lest they lead those that read to behave as my good friend seems to have behaved." All this the peasant heard, and from it he understood at last what was the matter with his neighbor, so he began calling aloud, "Open, your worships, to Senor Baldwin and to Senor the Marquis of Mantua, who comes badly wounded, and to Senor Abindaries, the Moor, whom the valiant Rodrigo de Narvaez, the Alcalde of Antequera, brings captive." At these words they all hurried out, and when they recognized their friend, master, and uncle, who had not yet dismounted from the ass, because he could not, they ran to embrace him. "Hold," said he, "for I am badly wounded through my horse's fault. Carry me to bed, and if possible send for the wise Urganda to cure and see to my wounds. See there, plague on it, cried the housekeeper at this. Did not my heart tell the truth as to which foot my master went lame of? To bed with your worship at once, and we will contrive to cure you here without fetching that Hergada. A curse I say once more, and 100 times more, on those books of chivalry that have brought your worship to such a pass. They carried him to bed at once, and after searching for his wounds could find none, but he said they were all bruises from having had a severe fall with his horse Rocinante when in combat with 10 giants, the biggest and the boldest to be found on earth. So, said the curate, are there giants in the dance? By the sign of the cross I will burn them to-morrow before the day over. They put a host of questions to Don Quixote, but his only answer to all was give him something to eat and leave him to sleep, for that was what he needed most. They did so, and the curate questioned the peasant at great length as to how he had found Don Quixote. Chapter 6 of the diverting and important scrutiny which the curate and the barber made in the library of our ingenious gentleman. He was still sleeping, so the curate asked the niece for the keys of the room where the books, the authors of all the mischief, were, and right willingly she gave them. They all went in, the housekeeper with them, and found more than 100 volumes of big books very well bound, and some other small ones. The moment the housekeeper saw them she turned about, and ran out of the room, and came back immediately with a saucer of holy water and a sprinkler, saying, Here, your worship, Señor Licentiate, sprinkle this room. Don't leave any magician of the many there are in these books to bewitch us in revenge for our design of banishing them from the world. The simplicity of the housekeeper made the licentiate laugh, and he directed the barber to give him the books one by one to see what they were about, as there may be some to be found among them that did not deserve the penalty of fire. No, said the niece, there is no reason for showing mercy to any of them. They have every one of them done mischief. Better fling them out of the window into the court and make a pile of them and set fire to them, or else carry them into the yard, and there a bonfire can be made without the smoke giving any annoyance. The housekeeper said the same, so eager were they both for the slaughter of those innocents, but the curate would not agree to it without first reading at any rate the titles. The first that Master Nicholas put into his hand was the 4 books of Amadis of Gaul. This seems a mysterious thing, said the curate, for, as I have heard say, this was the first book of chivalry printed in Spain, and from this all the others derive their birth and origin, so it seems to me that we ought inexorably to condemn it to the flames as the founder of so vile a sect. No, sir, said the barber, I too have heard say that this is the best of all the books of this kind that have been written, and so, as something singular in its line, it ought to be pardoned. True, said the curate, and for that reason let its life be spared for the present. Let us see that other which is next to it. It is, said the barber, the Sergas de Esplandian, the lawful son of Amadis of Gaul. Then truly, said the curate, the merit of the father must not be put down to the account of the son. Take it, mistress housekeeper, open the window and fling it into the yard, and lay the foundation of the pile for the bonfire we are to make. The housekeeper obeyed with great satisfaction, and the worthy Esplandian went flying into the yard to await with all patience the fire that was in store for him. Proceed, said the curate. This that comes next, said the barber, is Amadis of Greece, and truly, I believe all those on this side are of the same Amadis lineage. Then to the yard with the whole of them, said the curate, for to have the burning of Queen Pintaquinistra and the shepherd Darnel and his clogs, and the bedevilled and involved discourses of his author, I would burn with them the father who begot me if he were going about in the guise of a knight errant. I am of the same mind, said the barber. And so am I, added the niece. In that case, said the housekeeper, here, into the yard with them. They were handed to her, and as there were many of them, she spared herself the staircase, and flung them down out of the window. "Who is that tub there?" said the curate. "This," said the barber, "is Don Olivante de Laura." "The author of that book," said the curate, "was the same that wrote the Garden of Flowers, and truly there is no deciding which of the two books is the more truthful, or, to put it better, the less lying. All I can say is send this one into the yard for a swaggering fool." "This that follows is Florismart of Hyrcania," said the barber. "Senor Florismart here," said the curate. "Then by my faith he must take up his quarters in the yard, in spite of his marvelous birth and visionary adventures, for the stiffness and dryness of his style deserve nothing else. Into the yard with him and the other mistress, housekeeper." "With all my heart, senor," said she, and executed the order with great delight. "This," said the barber, "is the Night Platter." "An old book that," said the curate, "but I find no reason for clemency in it. Send it after the others without appeal," which was done. Another book was opened, and they saw it was entitled The Knight of the Cross. "For the sake of the holy name this book has," said the curate, "its ignorance may be excused. But then, they say, behind the cross there's the devil. To the fire with it." Taking down another book, the barber said, "This is the Mirror of Chivalry." "I know his worship," said the curate. "That is where Senor Reinaldos of Montalvan figures with his friends and comrades, greater thieves than Cacus, and the 12 peers of France with the veracious historian Turpin. However, I am not for condemning them to more than perpetual banishment, because, at any rate, they have some share in the invention of the famous Matteo Boiado, from where to the Christian poet Ludovico Ariosto wove his web, to whom, if I find him here, and speaking any language but his own, I shall show no respect whatever, but if he speaks his own tongue I will put him upon my head." "Well, I have him in Italian," said the barber, "but I do not understand him." "Nor would it be well that you should understand him," said the curate, "and on that score we may have excused the captain if he had not brought him into Spain and turned him into Castilian. He robbed him of a great deal of his natural force, and so do all those who try to turn books written in verse into another language, for, with all the pains they take and all the cleverness they show, they never can reach the level of the originals as they were first produced. In short, I say that this book, and all that may be found treating of those French affairs, should be thrown into or deposited in some dry well, until after more consideration it is settled what is to be done with them, excepting always one Bernardo del Carpio that is going about, and another called Roncesvalles, for these, if they come into my hands, shall pass at once into those of the housekeeper, and from hers into the fire without any reprieve." To all this the barber gave his assent, and looked upon it as right and proper, being persuaded that the curate was so staunch to the faith and loyal to the truth that he would not for the world say anything opposed to them. Opening another book he saw it was Pomerin de Oliva, and beside it was another called Pomerin of England, seeing which the licentiate said, "Let the olive be made firewood of at once and burned, until no ashes evening are left, and let that palm of England be kept and preserved as a thing that stands alone, and let such another case be made for it as that which Alexander found among the spoils of Darius and set aside for the safe keeping of the works of the poet Homer." This book, gossip, is of authority for 2 reasons. First, because it is very good, and secondly, because it is said to have been written by a wise and witty king of Portugal. All the adventures at the castle of Muragarda are excellent and of admirable contrivance, and the language is polished and clear, studying and observing the style befitting the speaker with propriety and judgment. So then, provided it seems good to you, Master Nicholas, I say let this and Amadis of Gaul be remitted the penalty of fire, and as for all the rest, let them perish without further question or query. "No, gossip," said the barber, "for this that I have here is the famous Don Bilianis." "Well," said the curate, that and the second, third, and fourth parts all stand in need of a little rhubarb to purge their excess of bile, and they must be cleared of all that stuff about the castle of fame and other greater affectations, to which end let them be allowed the overseas term, and according as they mend, so shall mercy or justice be meted out to them. And in the meantime, gossip, do you keep them in your house, and let no one read them. With all my heart, said the barber, and not caring to tire himself with reading more books of chivalry, he told the housekeeper to take all the big ones and throw them into the yard. It was not said to one dull or deaf, but to one who enjoyed burning them more than weaving the broadest and finest web that could be, and seizing about 8 at a time, she flung them out of the window. In carrying so many together, she let one fall at the feet of the barber, who took it up, curious to know whose it was, and found it said, History of the famous knight, Tirante el Blanco. God bless me, said the curate with a shout. Tirante el Blanco here, hand it over, gossip, for in it I reckon I have found a treasury of enjoyment and a mine of recreation. Here is Don Kyrie Lesson of Montalvan, a valiant knight, and his brother Thomas of Montalvan, and the knight Fonseca, with the battle the bold Tirante fought with the mastiff, and the witticisms of the damsel Placer Demivida, and the loves and wiles of the widow Riposata, and the empress in love with the squire Hippolito. In truth, gossip, by right of its style it is the best book in the world. Here knights eat and sleep, and die in their beds, and make their wills before dying, and a great deal more of which there is nothing in all the other books. Nevertheless, I say he who wrote it, for deliberately composing such fooleries, deserves to be sent to the galleys for life. Take it home with you and read it, and you will see that what I have said is true. As you will, said the barber, but what are we to do with these little books that are left? These must be, not chivalry, but poetry, said the curate, and opening one he saw it was the Diana of Jorge de Montemayor, and supposing all the others to be of the same sort, these, he said, do not deserve to be burned like the others, for they neither do nor can do the mischief the books of chivalry have done, being books of entertainment that can hurt no one. Ah, senor, said the niece, your worship had better order these to be burned as well as the others, for it would be no wonder if, after being cured of his chivalry disorder, my uncle, by reading these, took a fancy to turn shepherd and range the woods and fields singing and piping, or, what would be still worse, to turn poet, which they say is an incurable and infectious malady. The damsel is right, said the curate, and it will be well to put this stumbling block and temptation out of our friend's way. To begin, then, with the Diana of Montemayor, I am of opinion it should not be burned, but that it should be cleared of all that about the sage Felicia and the magic water, and of almost all the longer pieces of verse. Let it keep, and welcome, its prose and the honor of being the first of books of the kind. This that comes next, said the barber, is the Diana, entitled the second part by the Salamancan, and this other has the same title, and its author is Gil Polo. As for that of the Salamancan, replied the curate, let it go to swell the number of the condemned in the yard, and let Gil Polo's be preserved, as if it came from Apollo himself. But get on, gossip, and make haste, for it is growing late. This book, said the barber, opening another, is the 10 books of the Fortune of Love, written by Antonio de la Frasso, a Sardinian poet. By the orders I have received, said the curate, since Apollo has been Apollo, and the muses have been muses, and poets have been poets, so droll and absurd a book as this has never been written, and in its way it is the best and the most singular of all of the species that have as yet appeared, and he who has not read it may be sure he has never read what is delightful. Give it here, gossip, for I make more account of having found it than if they had given me a cassock of Florence stuff. He put it aside with extreme satisfaction, and the barber went on. These that come next are the Shepherd of Iberia, Nymphs of Henares, and the Enlightenment of Jealousy. Then all we have to do, said the curate, is to hand them over to the secular arm of the housekeeper, and ask me not why, or we shall never have done. This next is the pastor de Philida. No pastor that, said the curate, but a highly polished courtier. Let it be preserved as a precious jewel. This large one here, said the barber, is called the treasury of various poems. If there were not so many of them, said the curate, they would be more relished. This book must be weeded and cleansed of certain vulgarities, which it has with its excellences. Let it be preserved because the author is a friend of mine, and out of respect for other more heroic and loftier works that he has written. This, continued the barber, is the Cancionero of Lopez de Maldonado. The author of that book, too, said the curate, is a great friend of mine, and his verses from his own mouth are the admiration of all who hear them, for such is the sweetness of his voice that he enchants when he chants them. It gives rather too much of its eclogues, but what is good was never yet plentiful. Let it be kept with those that have been set apart. But what book is that next it? The Galatea of Miguel de Cervantes, said the barber. That Cervantes has been for many years a great friend of mine, and to my knowledge he has had more experience in reverses than in verses. Chapter 7 of the Second Sally of Our Worthy Knight Don Quixote of La Mancha. At this instant Don Quixote began shouting out, Hear, hear, valiant knights, here is need for you to put forth the may of your strong arms, for they of the court are gaining the mastery in the tourney. Called away by this noise and outcry, they proceeded no farther with the scrutiny of the remaining books, and so it is thought that the Carolia, the Lion of Spain, and The Deeds of the Emperor, written by Don Luis de Avila, went to the fire unseen and unheard, for no doubt they were among those that remained, and perhaps if the curate had seen them they would not have undergone so severe a sentence. When they reached Don Quixote he was already out of bed, and was still shouting and raving, and slashing and cutting all round, as wide awake as if he had never slept. They closed with him and by force got him back to bed, and when he had become a little calm, addressing the curate, he said to him, Of a truth, Senor Archbishop Turpin, it is a great disgrace for us who call ourselves the 12 Peers, so carelessly to allow the knights of the court to gain the victory in this tourney, we the adventurers having carried off the honor on the 3 former days. Hush, gossip, said the curate. Please God, the luck may turn, and what is lost today may be won to tomorrow. For the present let your worship have a care of your health, for it seems to me that you are over-fatigued, if not badly wounded. Wounded no, said Don Quixote, but bruised and battered no doubt, for that bastard Don Roland has cudgelled me with the trunk of an oak tree, and all for envy, because he sees that I alone rival him in his achievements. But I should not call myself Reinaldo's of Montalvan did he not pay me for it in spite of all his enchantments as soon as I rise from this bed. For the present let them bring me something to eat, for that, I feel, is what will be more to my purpose, and leave it to me to avenge myself. They did as he wished. They gave him something to eat, and once more he fell asleep, leaving them marveling at his madness. That night the housekeeper burned to ashes all the books that were in the yard and in the whole house, and some must have been consumed that deserved preservation in everlasting archives, but their fate and the laziness of the examiner did not permit it, and so in them was verified the proverb that the innocent suffer for the guilty. One of the remedies which the curate and the barber immediately applied to their friend's disorder was to wall up and plaster the room where the books were, so that when he got up he should not find them, possibly the cause being removed the effect may cease, and they may say that a magician had carried them off, room and all, and this was done with all dispatch. 2 days later Don Quixote got up, and the first thing he did was to go and look at his books, and not finding the room where he had left it, he wandered from side to side looking for it. He came to the place where the door used to be and tried it with his hands and turned and twisted his eyes in every direction without saying a word. But after a good while he asked his housekeeper whereabouts was the room that held his books. The housekeeper, who had been already well instructed in what she was to answer, said, "What room or what nothing is it that your worship is looking for? There are neither room nor books in this house now, for the devil himself has carried all away." "It was not the devil," said the niece, "but a magician who came on a cloud one night after the day your worship left this, and dismounting from a serpent that he rode he entered the room, and what he did there I know not, but after a little while he made off, flying through the roof, and left the house full of smoke, and when we went to see what he had done we saw neither book nor room. But we remember very well, the housekeeper and I, that on leaving, the old villain said in a loud voice, that, for a private grudge he owed the owner of the books and the room, he had done mischief in that house that would be discovered by and by. He said too that his name was the sage Manhattan." "He must have said Friston," said Don Quixote. "I don't know whether he called himself Friston or Fritten," said the housekeeper. "I only know that his name ended with ton." "So it does," said Don Quixote, "and he is a sage magician, a great enemy of mine, who has a spite against me because he knows by his arts and lore that in process of time I am to engage in single combat with a knight, whom he befriends and that I am to conquer, and he will be unable to prevent it. And for this reason he endeavors to do me all the ill turns that he can, but I promise him it will be hard for him to oppose or avoid what is decreed by heaven." "Who doubts that?" said the niece. "But, uncle, who mixes you up in these quarrels? Would it not be better to remain at peace in your own house, instead of roaming the world looking for better bread than ever came of wheat, never reflecting that many go for wool and come back shorn?" "Oh, niece of mine," replied Don Quixote, "how much astray are you in your reckoning? Before they shear me I shall have plucked away and stripped off the beards of all who dare to touch only the tip of a hair of mine." The two were unwilling to make any further answer, as they saw that his anger was kindling. In short, then, he remained at home 15 days very quietly without showing any signs of a desire to take up with his former delusions, and during this time he held lively discussions with his two gossips, the curate and the barber, on the point he maintained that knights errant were what the world stood most in need of, and that in him was to be accomplished the revival of knight errantry. The curate sometimes contradicted him, sometimes agreed with him, for if he had not observed this precaution he would have been unable to bring him to reason. Meanwhile Don Quixote worked upon a farm laborer, a neighbor of his, an honest man if truly that title can be given to him who is poor, but with very little wit in his pate. In a word, he so talked him over, and with such persuasions and promises, that the poor clown made up his mind to sally forth with him and serve him as esquire. Don Quixote, among other things, told him he ought to be ready to go with him gladly, because any moment an adventure may occur that may win an island in the twinkling of an eye and leave him governor of it. On these and the like promises Sancho Panza, for so the laborer was called, left wife and children, and engaged himself as esquire to his neighbor. Don Quixote next set about getting some money, and selling one thing and pawning another, and making a bad bargain in every case he got together a fair sum. He provided himself with a buckler, which he begged as a loan from a friend, and restoring his battered helmet as best he could, he warned his squire Sancho of the day and hour he meant to set out, that he may provide himself with what he thought most needful. Above all, he charged him to take alforjas with him. The other said he would, and that he meant to take also a very good ass he had, as he was not much given to going on foot. About the ass, Don Quixote hesitated a little, trying whether he could call to mind any knight errant taking with him an esquire mounted on ass back, but no instance occurred to his memory. For all that, however, he determined to take him, intending to furnish him with a more honorable mount when a chance of it presented itself, by appropriating the horse of the first discourteous knight he encountered. Himself he provided with shirts and such other things as he could, according to the advice the host had given him, all which being done, without taking leave, Sancho Panza of his wife and children, or Don Quixote of his housekeeper and niece, they sallied forth unseen by anybody from the village one night, and made such good way in the course of it that by daylight they held themselves safe from discovery. Evening should search be made for them. Sancho rode on his ass like a patriarch, with his alforjas and boda, and, longing to see himself soon governor of the island his master had promised him, Don Quixote decided upon taking the same route and road he had taken on his first journey, that over the Campo de Montiel, which he travelled with less discomfort than on the last occasion, for, as it was early morning and the rays of the sun fell on them obliquely, the heat did not distress them. And now said Sancho Panza to his master, "Your worship will take care, Sir Knight Errant, not to forget about the island you have promised me, for be it ever so big I'll be equal to governing it." To which Don Quixote replied, "You must know, friend Sancho Panza, that it was a practice very much in vogue with the knights errant of old to make their squires governors of the islands or kingdoms they won, and I am determined that there shall be no failure on my part in so liberal a custom. On the contrary, I mean to improve upon it, for they sometimes, and perhaps most frequently, waited until their squires were old, and then, when they had had enough of service and hard days and worse nights, they gave them some title or other of count, or at the most marquis, of some valley or province more or less. But if you livest and I live, it may well be that before 6 days are over, I may have won some kingdom that has others dependent upon it, which will be just the thing to enable you to be crowned king of one of them. Nor needst you count this wonderful, for things and chances fall to the lot of such knights in ways so unexampled and unexpected that I may easily give you evening more than I promise you." "In that case," said Sancho Panza, "if I should become a king by one of those miracles your worship speaks of, evening Juana Gutierrez, my old woman, would come to be queen and my children infants." "Well, who doubts it?" said Don Quixote. "I doubt it," replied Sancho Panza, "because for my part I am persuaded that though God should shower down kingdoms upon earth, not one of them would fit the head of Mary Gutierrez." Chapter 8 of the good fortune which the valiant Don Quixote had in the terrible and undreamt of adventure of the windmills, with other occurrences worthy to be fitly recorded. At this point they came in sight of 30-40 windmills that there are on plain, and as soon as Don Quixote saw them he said to his squire, "Fortune is arranging matters for us better than we could have shaped our desires ourselves, for look there, friend Sancho Panza, where 30 or more monstrous giants present themselves, all of whom I mean to engage in battle and slay, and with whose spoils we shall begin to make our fortunes, for this is righteous warfare, and it is God's good service to sweep so evil a breed from off the face of the earth." "What giants?" said Sancho Panza. "Those you seest there," answered his master, "with the long arms, and some have them nearly 2 leagues long." "Look, your worship," said Sancho, "what we see there are not giants but windmills, and what seem to be their arms are the sails that turn by the wind make the millstone go." "It is easy to see," replied Don Quixote, "that you are not used to this business of adventures. Those are giants, and if you are afraid, away with you out of this, and betake thyself to prayer while I engage them in fierce and unequal combat." So saying, he gave the spur to his steed Rocinante, heedless of the cries his squire Sancho sent after him, warning him that most certainly they were windmills and not giants he was going to attack. He, however, was so positive they were giants that he neither heard the cries of Sancho nor perceived, near as he was, what they were, but made at them shouting, "Fly not, cowards and vile beings, for a single knight attacks you." A slight breeze at this moment sprang up, and the great sails began to move, seeing which Don Quixote exclaimed, "Though ye flourish more arms than the giant Briareus, ye have to reckon with me." So saying, and commending himself with all his heart to his lady, Dulcinea, imploring her to support him in such a peril, with lance in rest and covered by his buckler, he charged at Rocinante's fullest gallop, and fell upon the first mill that stood in front of him. But as he drove his lance point into the sail, the wind whirled it round with such force that it shivered the lance to pieces, sweeping with it horse and rider, who went rolling over on the plain in a sorry condition. Sancho hastened to his assistance as fast as his ass could go, and when he came up found him unable to move. With such a shock had Rocinante fallen with him. "God bless me," said Sancho, "did I not tell your worship to mind what you were about, for they were only windmills, and no one could have made any mistake about it but one who had something of the same kind in his head." "Hush, friend Sancho," replied Don Quixote, "the fortunes of war more than any other are liable to frequent fluctuations, and moreover I think, and it is the truth, that same sage Friston who carried off my study and books has turned these giants into mills in order to rob me of the glory of vanquishing them. Such is the enmity he bears me, but in the end his wicked arts will avail but little against my good sword." "God order it as he may," said Sancho Panza, and helping him to rise got him up again on Rocinante, whose shoulder was half out. And then, discussing the late adventure, they followed the road to Puerto Lapis, for there, said Don Quixote, they could not fail to find adventures in abundance and variety, as it was a great thoroughfare. For all that, he was much grieved at the loss of his lance, and saying so to his squire, he added, "I remember having read how a Spanish knight, Diego Perez de Vargas by name, having broken his sword in battle, tore from an oak a ponderous bough or branch, and with it did such things that day, and hounded so many Moors, that he got the surname of Machuca, and he and his descendants from that day forth were called Vargas y Machuca. I mention this because from the first oak I see I mean to rend such another branch, large and stout like that, with which I am determined and resolved to do such deeds that you mayest deem thyself very fortunate in being found worthy to come and see them, and be an eyewitness of things that will with difficulty be believed." "Be that as God will," said Sancho, "I believe it all as your worship says it, but straighten yourself a little, for you seem all on one side, may be from the shaking of the fall." "That is the truth," said Don Quixote, "and if I make no complaint of the pain it is because knights errant are not permitted to complain of any wound, evening though their bowels be coming out through it." "If so," said Sancho, "I have nothing to say, but God knows I would rather your worship complained when anything ailed you. For my part, I confess I must complain however small the ache may be, unless this rule about not complaining extends to the squires of knights errant also." Don Quixote could not help laughing at his squire's simplicity, and he assured him he may complain whenever and however he chose, just as he liked, for, so far, he had never read of anything to the contrary in the order of knighthood. Sancho bade him remember it was dinner time, to which his master answered, that he wanted nothing himself just then, but that he may eat when he had a mind. With this permission Sancho settled himself as comfortably as he could on his beast, and taking out of the alforjas what he had stowed away in them, he jogged along behind his master, munching deliberately, and from time to time taking a pull at the bota with a relish that the thirstiest tapster in Malaga may have envied. And while he went on in this way, gulping down draught after draught, he never gave a thought to any of the promises his master had made him, nor did he rate it as hardship, but rather as recreation, going in quest of adventures, however dangerous they may be. Finally they passed the night among some trees, from one of which Don Quixote plucked a dry branch to serve him after a fashion as a lance, and fixed on it the head he had removed from the broken one. All that night Don Quixote lay awake thinking of his lady Dulcinea, in order to conform to what he had read in his books. How many a night in the forests and deserts knights used to lie sleepless, supported by the memory of their mistresses. Not so did Sancho Panza spend it, for having his stomach full of something stronger than chicory water he made but one sleep of it, and, if his master had not called him, neither the rays of the sun beating on his face nor all the cheery notes of the birds welcoming the approach of day would have had power to waken him. On getting up he tried the Boda, and found it somewhat less full than the night before, which grieved his heart because they did not seem to be on the way to remedy the deficiency readily. Don Quixote did not care to break his fast, for, as has been already said, he confined himself to savory recollections for nourishment. They returned to the road they had set out with, leading to Puerto Lapis, and at 3 in the afternoon they came in sight of it. Here, brother Sancho Panza, said Don Quixote when he saw it, we may plunge our hands up to the elbows in what they call adventures. But observe, evening shouldst you see me in the greatest danger in the world, you must not put a hand to your sword in my defense, unless truly you perceivest that those who assail me are rabble or base folk, for in that case you mayest very properly aid me. But if they be knights, it is on no account permitted or allowed you by the laws of knighthood to help me until you have been dubbed a knight. Most certainly, Senor, replied Sancho, your worship shall be fully obeyed in this matter, all the more as of myself I am peaceful and no friend to mixing in strife and quarrels. It is true that as regards the defense of my own person I shall not give much heed to those laws, for laws human and divine allow each one to defend himself against any assailant whatever. That I grant, said Don Quixote. But in this matter of aiding me against knights you must put a restraint upon your natural impetuosity. I will do so, I promise you, answered Sancho, and will keep this precept as carefully as Sunday. While they were thus talking there appeared on the road 2 friars of the Order of St. Benedict, mounted on 2 dromedaries, for not less tall were the 2 mules they rode on. They wore traveling spectacles and carried sunshades, and behind them came a coach attended by 4 or 5 persons on horseback and 2 muleteers on foot. In the coach there was, as afterwards appeared, a Biscay lady on her way to Seville, where her husband was about to take passage for the Indies with an appointment of high honor. The friars, though going the same road, were not in her company, but the moment Don Quixote perceived them he said to his squire, either I am mistaken, or this is going to be the most famous adventure that has ever been seen, for those black bodies we see there must be, and doubtless are magicians who are carrying off some stolen princess in that coach, and with all my may I must undo this wrong. This will be worse than the windmills, said Sancho. Look, Senor, those are friars of St. Benedict, and the coach plainly belongs to some travelers. I tell you to mind well what you are about, and don't let the devil mislead you. I have told you already, Sancho, replied Don Quixote, that on the subject of adventures you knowest little. What I say is the truth, as you shall see soon. So saying, he advanced and posted himself in the middle of the road along which the friars were coming, and as soon as he thought they had come near enough to hear what he said, he cried aloud, devilish and unnatural beings, release instantly the highborn princesses whom you are carrying off by force in this coach, else prepare to meet a speedy death as the just punishment of your evil deeds. The friars drew rein and stood wondering at the appearance of Don Quixote, as well as at his words, to which they replied, Senor Caballero, we are not devilish or unnatural, but 2 brothers of St. Benedict following our road, nor do we know whether or not there are any captive princesses coming in this coach. No soft words with me, for I know you. Lying rabble, said Don Quixote, and without waiting for a reply he spurred Rocinante, and with levelled lance charged the first friar with such fury and determination that, if the friar had not flung himself off the mule, he would have brought him to the ground against his will, and sore wounded, if not killed outright. The second brother, seeing how his comrade was treated, drove his heels into his castle of a mule and made off across the country faster than the wind. Sancho Panza, when he saw the friar on the ground, dismounting briskly from his ass, rushed towards him and began to strip off his gown. At that instant the friar's muleteers came up and asked what he was stripping him for. Sancho answered them that this fell to him lawfully as spoil of the battle which his lord Don Quixote had won. The muleteers, who had no idea of a joke and did not understand all this about battles and spoils, seeing that Don Quixote was some distance off talking to the travelers in the coach, fell upon Sancho, knocked him down, and leaving hardly a hair in his beard, belabored him with kicks and left him stretched, breathless and senseless on the ground, and without any more delay helped the friar to mount, who, trembling, terrified, and pale, as soon as he found himself in the saddle, spurred after his companion, who was standing at a distance looking on, watching the result of the onslaught. Then, not caring to wait for the end of the affair just begun, they pursued their journey, making more crosses than if they had the devil after them. Don Quixote was, as has been said, speaking to the lady in the coach. "Your beauty, lady mine," said he, "may now dispose of your person as may be most in accordance with your pleasure, for the pride of your ravishers lies prostrate on the ground through this strong arm of mine, and lest you should be pining to know the name of your deliverer, know that I am called Don Quixote of La Mancha, knight-errant and adventurer, and captive to the peerless and beautiful lady Dulcinea del Toboso, and in return for the service you have received of me I ask no more than that you should return to El Toboso, and on my behalf present yourself before that lady and tell her what I have done to set you free." One of the squires in attendance upon the coach, a Biscayan, was listening to all Don Quixote was saying, and perceiving that he would not allow the coach to go on, but was saying it must return at once to El Toboso, he made at him, and seizing his lance addressed him in bad Castilian and worse Biscayan after his fashion, "Begone, caballero, and ill go with you, by the God that made me, unless you quittest coach, slayest you as are here a Biscayan." Don Quixote understood him quite well, and answered him very quietly, "If you were a knight, as you are none, I should have already chastised your folly and rashness, miserable creature." To which the Biscayan returned, "I know, gentlemen, I swear to God you least as I am Christian, if you droppest lance and drawst sword, soon shall you see you are carrying water to the cat. Biscayan on land, Hidalgo at sea, Hidalgo at the devil, and look, if you sayest otherwise you least, you will see soon," said Agrades, replied Don Quixote, and throwing his lance on the ground he drew his sword, braced his buckler on his arm, and attacked the Biscayan, bent upon taking his life. The Biscayan, when he saw him coming on, though he wished to dismount from his mule, in which, being one of those sorry ones let out for hire, he had no confidence, had no choice but to draw his sword. It was lucky for him, however, that he was near the coach, from which he was able to snatch a cushion that served him for a shield, and they went at one another as if they had been two mortal enemies. The others strove to make peace between them, but could not, for the Biscayan declared in his disjointed phrase that if they did not let him finish his battle he would kill his mistress and every one that strove to prevent him. The lady in the coach, amazed and terrified at what she saw, ordered the coachman to draw aside a little, and set herself to watch the severe struggle, in the course of which the Biscayan smote Don Quixote a mighty stroke on the shoulder over the top of his buckler, which, given to one without armor, would have cleft him to the waist. Don Quixote, feeling the weight of this prodigious blow, cried aloud, saying, "O lady of my soul, Dulcinea, flower of beauty, come to the aid of this your knight, who, in fulfilling his obligations to your beauty, finds himself in this extreme peril. To say this, to lift his sword, to shelter himself well behind his buckler, and to assail the Biscayan was the work of an instant, determined as he was to venture all upon a single blow. The Biscayan, seeing him come on in this way, was convinced of his courage by his spirited bearing, and resolved to follow his example. So he waited for him, keeping well under cover of his cushion, being unable to execute any sort of maneuver with his mule, which, dead tired and never meant for this kind of game, could not stir a step. On, then, as aforesaid, came Don Quixote against the wary Biscayan, with uplifted sword and a firm intention of splitting him in half, while on his side the Biscayan waited for him sword in hand and under the protection of his cushion, and all present stood trembling, waiting in suspense the result of blows such as threatened to fall, and the lady in the coach and the rest of her following were making 1,000 vows and offerings to all the images and shrines of Spain, that God may deliver her squire and all of them from this great peril in which they found themselves. But it spoils all that at this point and crisis the author of the history leaves this battle impending, giving as excuse that he could find nothing more written about these achievements of Don Quixote than what has been already set forth. Chapter 9, in which is concluded and finished the terrific battle between the gallant Biscayan and the valiant Manchegan. In the first part of this history we left the valiant Biscayan and the renowned Don Quixote with drawn swords uplifted, ready to deliver two such furious slashing blows, that if they had fallen full and fair they would at least have split and cleft them asunder from top to toe and laid them open like a pomegranate. And at this so critical point the delightful history came to a stop and stood cut short without any intimation from the author where what was missing was to be found. This distressed me greatly, because the pleasure derived from having read such a small portion turned to vexation at the thought of the poor chance that presented itself of finding the large part that, so it seemed to me, was missing of such an interesting tale. It appeared to me to be a thing impossible and contrary to all precedent that so good a knight should have been without some sage to undertake the task of writing his marvelous achievements, a thing that was never wanting to any of those knights-errant who, they say, went after adventures, for every one of them had one or two sages as if made on purpose, who not only recorded their deeds but described their most trifling thoughts and follies, however secret they may be. And such a good knight could not have been so unfortunate as not to have what Plater and others like him had in abundance. And so I could not bring myself to believe that such a gallant tale had been left maimed and mutilated, and I laid the blame on time, the devourer and destroyer of all things, that had either concealed or consumed it. On the other hand, it struck me that, inasmuch as among his books there had been found such modern ones as The Enlightenment of Jealousy and The Nymphs and Shepherds of Heners, his story must likewise be modern, and that though it may not be written, it may exist in the memory of the people of his village and of those in the neighborhood. This reflection kept me perplexed and longing to know really and truly the whole life and wondrous deeds of our famous Spaniard, Don Quixote of La Mancha, light and mirror of Manchegan chivalry, and the first that in our age and in these so evil days devoted himself to the labor and exercise of the arms of knight-errantry, righting wrongs, succoring widows, and protecting damsels of that sort that used to ride about, whip in hand, on their palfreys, with all their virginity about them, from mountain to mountain and valley to valley, for if it were not for some ruffian, or boor with a hood and hatchet, or monstrous giant, that forced them, there were in days of yore damsels that at the end of 80 years, in all which time they had never slept a day under a roof, went to their graves, as much maids as the mothers that bore them. I say, then, that in these and other respects our gallant Don Quixote is worthy of everlasting and notable praise, nor should it be withheld evening from me for the labor and pains spent in searching for the conclusion of this delightful history, though I know well that if heaven, chance, and good fortune had not helped me, the world would have remained deprived of an entertainment and pleasure that for a couple of hours or so may well occupy him who shall read it attentively. The discovery of it occurred in this way. One day, as I was in the Alcana of Toledo, a boy came up to sell some pamphlets and old papers to a silk mercer, and as I am fond of reading, evening the very scraps of paper in the streets, led by this natural bent of mine, I took up one of the pamphlets the boy had for sale, and saw that it was in characters which I recognized as Arabic, and as I was unable to read them though I could recognize them, I looked about to see if there were any Spanish-speaking Morisco at hand to read them for me, nor was there any great difficulty in finding such an interpreter, for evening had I sought one for an older and better language I should have found him. In short, chance provided me with one who, when I told him what I wanted and put the book into his hands, opened it in the middle and after reading a little in it began to laugh. I asked him what he was laughing at, and he replied that it was at something the book had written in the margin by way of a note. I bade him tell it to me, and he still laughing said, in the margin, as I told you, this is written, this Dulcinea del Toboso so often mentioned in this history had, they say, the best hand of any woman in all La Mancha for salting pigs. When I heard Dulcinea del Toboso named, I was struck with surprise and amazement, for it occurred to me at once that these pamphlets contained the history of Don Quixote. With this idea I pressed him to read the beginning, and doing so, turning the Arabic offhand into Castilian, he told me it meant History of Don Quixote of La Mancha, written by Said Hamid Benengeli, an Arab historian. It required great caution to hide the joy I felt when the title of the book reached my ears, and snatching it from the silk mercer, I bought all the papers and pamphlets from the boy for half a real, and if he had had his wits about him and had known how eager I was for them, he may have safely calculated on making more than 6 reals by the bargain. I withdrew at once with the Morisco into the cloister of the cathedral, and begged him to turn all these pamphlets that related to Don Quixote into the Castilian tongue, without omitting or adding anything to them, offering him whatever payment he pleased. He was satisfied with 2 arrobas of raisins and 2 bushels of wheat, and promised to translate them faithfully and with all dispatch, but to make the matter easier, and not to let such a precious find out of my hands, I took him to my house, where in little more than a month and a half he translated the whole just as it is set down here. In the first pamphlet the battle between Don Quixote and the Biscayan was drawn to the very life. They planted in the same attitude as the history describes, their swords raised, and the one protected by his buckler, the other by his cushion, and the Biscayan's mule so true to nature that it could be seen to be a hired one a bowshot off. The Biscayan had an inscription under his feet which said Don Sancho de Azbecha, which no doubt must have been his name, and at the feet of Rocinante was another that said Don Quixote. Rocinante was marvelously portrayed, so long and thin, so lank and lean, with so much backbone and so far gone in consumption that he showed plainly with what judgment and propriety the name of Rocinante had been bestowed upon him. Near him was Sancho Panza, holding the halter of his ass, at whose feet was another label that said Sancho Zancas, and according to the picture he must have had a big belly, a short body, and long shanks, for which reason, no doubt, the names of Panza and Zancas were given him, for by these 2 surnames the history several times calls him. Some other trifling particulars may be mentioned, but they are all of slight importance and have nothing to do with the true relation of the history, and no history can be bad so long as it is true. if against the present one any objection be raised on the score of its truth, it can only be that its author was an Arab, as lying is a very common propensity with those of that nation, though, as they are such enemies of ours, it is conceivable that there were omissions rather than additions made in the course of it, and this is my own opinion, for where he could and should give freedom to his pen in praise of so worthy a knight, he seems to me deliberately to pass it over in silence, which is ill done and worse contrived, for it is the business and duty of historians to be exact, truthful, and wholly free from passion, and neither interest nor fear, hatred nor love, should make them swerve from the path of truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, storehouse of deeds, witness for the past, example and counsel for the present, and warning for the future. In this I know will be found all that can be desired in the pleasantest, and if it be wanting in any good quality, I maintain it is the fault of its hound of an author and not the fault of the subject. To be brief, its second part, according to the translation, began in this way: with trenchant swords upraised and poised on high, it seemed as though the two valiant and wrathful combatants stood threatening heaven and earth and hell, with such resolution and determination did they bear themselves. The fiery Biscayan was the first to strike a blow, which was delivered with such force and fury that had not the sword turned in its course, that single stroke would have sufficed to put an end to the bitter struggle and to all the adventures of our knight. But that good fortune, which reserved him for greater things, turned aside the sword of his adversary, so that although it smote him upon the left shoulder, it did him no more harm than to strip all that side of its armor, carrying away a great part of his helmet with half of his ear, all which with fearful ruin fell to the ground, leaving him in a sorry plight. Good God! Who is there that could properly describe the rage that filled the heart of our Manchegan when he saw himself dealt with in this fashion? All that can be said is, it was such that he again raised himself in his stirrups, and grasping his sword more firmly with both hands, he came down on the Biscayan with such fury, smiting him full over the cushion and over the head, that evening so good a shield proving useless as if a mountain had fallen on him, he began to bleed from nose, mouth, and ears, reeling as if about to fall backwards from his mule, as no doubt he would have done had he not flung his arms about its neck. At the same time, however, he slipped his feet out of the stirrups and then unclasped his arms, and the mule, taking fright at the terrible blow, made off across the plain, and with a few plunges flung its master to the ground. Don Quixote stood looking on very calmly, and when he saw him fall, leaped from his horse and with great briskness ran to him, and presenting the point of his sword to his eyes, bade him surrender, or he would cut his head off. The Biscayan was so bewildered that he was unable to answer a word, and it would have gone hard with him, so blind was Don Quixote, had not the ladies in the coach, who had hitherto been watching the combat in great terror, hastened to where he stood and implored him, with earnest entreaties, to grant them the great grace and favor of sparing their squire's life. To which Don Quixote replied with much gravity and dignity, "In truth, fair ladies, I am well content to do what ye ask of me, but it must be on one condition and understanding, which is, that this knight promise me to go to the village of El Toboso, and on my behalf present himself before the peerless Lady Dulcinea, that she deal with him as shall be most pleasing to her." The terrified and disconsolate ladies, without discussing Don Quixote's demand or asking who Dulcinea may be, promised that their squire should do all that had been commanded. Chapter 10 of the pleasant discourse that passed between Don Quixote and his squire, Sancho Panza. Now by this time Sancho had risen, rather the worse for the handling of the friars muleteers, and stood watching the battle of his master, Don Quixote, and praying to God in his heart that it may be his will to grant him the victory, and that he may by that win some island to make him governor of, as he had promised. Seeing therefore, that the struggle was now over, and that his master was returning to Mount Rocinante, he approached to hold the stirrup for him, and, before he could mount, he went on his knees before him, and taking his hand, kissed it, saying, "May it please your worship, Senor Don Quixote, to give me the government of that island which has been won in this hard fight, for be it ever so big, I feel myself in sufficient force to be able to govern it as much and as well as anyone in the world who has ever governed islands." To which Don Quixote replied, "You must take notice, brother Sancho, that this adventure and those like it are not adventures of islands, but of crossroads, in which nothing is got except a broken head or an ear. The less, have patience, for adventures will present themselves from which I may make you, not only a governor, but something more." Sancho gave him many thanks, and again kissing his hand and the skirt of his hauberk, helped him to Mount Rocinante, and mounting his ass himself, proceeded to follow his master, who at a brisk pace, without taking leave or saying anything further to the ladies belonging to the coach, turned into a wood that was hard by. Sancho followed him at his ass's best trot, but Rocinante stepped out so that, seeing himself left behind, he was forced to call to his master to wait for him. Don Quixote did so, reining in Rocinante until his weary squire came up, who on reaching him, said, "It seems to me, Senor, it would be prudent in us to go and take refuge in some church, for, seeing how mauled he with whom you fought has been left, it will be no wonder if they give information of the affair to the Holy Brotherhood and arrest us, and, faith, if they do, before we come out of jail we shall have to sweat for it." "Peace," said Don Quixote, "where have you ever seen or heard that a knight-errant has been arraigned before a court of justice, however many homicides he may have committed?" "I know nothing about umsils," answered Sancho, "nor in my life have had anything to do with one. I only know that the Holy Brotherhood looks after those who fight in the fields, and in that other matter I do not meddle." "Then you needst have no uneasiness, my friend," said Don Quixote, "for I will deliver you out of the hands of the Chaldeans, much more out of those of the Brotherhood. But tell me, as you livest, have you seen a more valiant knight than I in all the known world? Have you read in history of any who has or had higher mettle in attack, more spirit in maintaining it, more dexterity in wounding, or skill in overthrowing?" "The truth is," answered Sancho, "that I have never read any history, for I can neither read nor write, but what I will venture to bet is that a more daring master than your worship I have never served in all the days of my life, and God grant that this daring be not paid for where I have said. What I beg of your worship is to dress your wound, for a great deal of blood flows from that ear, and I have here some lint and a little white ointment in the alforges, all that may be well dispensed with," said Don Quixote. "If I had remembered to make a vial of the balsam of Fierabras, for time and medicine are saved by one single drop." "What vial and what balsam is that?" said Sancho Panza. "It is a balsam," answered Don Quixote, "the receipt of which I have in my memory, with which one need have no fear of death, or dread dying of any wound, and so when I make it and give it to you, you have nothing to do when in some battle you ceased. They have cut me in half through the middle of the body, as is wont to happen frequently, but neatly and with great nicety, before the blood congeal, to place that portion of the body which shall have fallen to the ground upon the other half which remains in the saddle, taking care to fit it on evenly and exactly. Then you shall give me to drink but 2 drops of the balsam I have mentioned, and you shall see me become sounder than an apple." "If that be so," said Panza, "I renounce henceforth the government of the promised island, and desire nothing more in payment of my many and faithful services than that your worship give me the receipt of this supreme liquor, for I am persuaded it will be worth more than 2 reals an ounce anywhere, and I want no more to pass the rest of my life in ease and honor. But it remains to be told if it costs much to make it." "With less than 3 reals, 6 quarts of it may be made," said Don Quixote. "Sinner that I am, said Sancho. Then why does your worship put off making it and teaching it to me? Peace, friend, answered Don Quixote. Greater secrets I mean to teach you and greater favors to bestow upon you. And for the present let us see to the dressing, for my ear pains me more than I could wish. Sancho took out some lint and ointment from the alforges, but when Don Quixote came to see his helmet shattered, he was like to lose his senses, and clapping his hand upon his sword and raising his eyes to heaven, said, I swear by the Creator of all things and the four Gospels in their fullest extent, to do as the great Marquis of Mantua did when he swore to avenge the death of his nephew Baldwin, and that was not to eat bread from a tablecloth, nor embrace his wife, and other points which, though I cannot now call them to mind, I here grant as expressed until I take complete vengeance upon him who has committed such an offense against me. Hearing this, Sancho said to him, Your worship should bear in mind, Señor Don Quixote, that if the knight has done what was commanded him in going to present himself before my lady Dulcinea del Toboso, he will have done all that he was bound to do, and does not deserve further punishment, unless he commits some new offense. You have said well and hit the point, answered Don Quixote, and so I recall the oath in so far as relates to taking fresh vengeance on him, but I make and confirm it anew to lead the life I have said until such time as I take by force from some knight another helmet such as this and as good, and think not, Sancho, that I am raising smoke with straw in doing so, for I have one to imitate in the matter, since the very same thing to a hair happened in the case of Mambrino's helmet, which cost Sacripante so dear. Señor, replied Sancho, let your worship send all such oaths to the devil, for they are very pernicious to salvation and prejudicial to the conscience. Just tell me now, if for several days to come we fall in with no man armed with a helmet, what are we to do? Is the oath to be observed, in spite of all the inconvenience and discomfort it will be to sleep in your clothes, and not to sleep in a house, and 1,000 other mortifications contained in the oath of that old fool the Marquis of Mantua, which your worship is now wanting to revive? Let your worship observe that there are no men in armor traveling on any of these roads, nothing but carriers and carters, who not only do not wear helmets, but perhaps never heard tell of them all their lives. You are wrong there, said Don Quixote, for we shall not have been above 2 hours among these crossroads before we see more men in armor than came to Albraca to win the fair Angelica. Enough, said Sancho, so be it then, and God grant us success, and that the time for winning that island which is costing me so dear may soon come, and then let me die. I have already told you, Sancho, said Don Quixote, not to give thyself any uneasiness on that score, for if an island should fail, there is the kingdom of Denmark or of Sobradisa, which will fit you as a ring fits the finger, and all the more that, being on terra firma, you will all the better enjoy thyself. But let us leave that to its own time. See if you have anything for us to eat in those alforges, because we must soon go in quest of some castle where we may lodge tonight and make the balsam I told you of, for I swear to you by God, this ear is giving me great pain. I have here an onion and a little cheese and a few scraps of bread, said Sancho, but they are not victuals fit for a valiant knight like your worship. How little you knowest about it, answered Don Quixote. I would have you to know, Sancho, that it is the glory of knights errant to go without eating for a month, and evening when they do eat, that it should be of what comes first to hand, and this would have been clear to you hadst you read as many histories as I have, for, though they are very many, among them all I have found no mention made of knights errant eating, unless by accident or at some sumptuous banquets prepared for them, and the rest of the time they passed in dalliance. And though it is plain they could not do without eating and performing all the other natural functions, because, in fact, they were men like ourselves, it is plain, too, that, wandering as they did the most part of their lives through woods and wilds and without a cook, Their most usual fare would be rustic, viands such as those you now offer me, so that, friend Sancho, let not that distress you which pleases me, and do not seek to make a new world, or pervert knight-errantry. Pardon me, your worship, said Sancho, for, as I cannot read or write, as I said just now, I neither know nor comprehend the rules of the profession of chivalry. Henceforward I will stock the alforjas with every kind of dry fruit for your worship, as you are a knight, and for myself, as I am not one, I will furnish them with poultry and other things more substantial. I do not say, Sancho, replied Don Quixote, that it is imperative on knights errant not to eat anything else but the fruits you speakest of, only that their more usual diet must be those, and certain herbs they found in the fields which they knew and I know too. A good thing it is, answered Sancho, to know those herbs, for to my thinking it will be needful some day to put that knowledge into practice. And here taking out what he said he had brought, the pair made their repast peaceably and sociably. Chapter 11. What befell Don Quixote with certain goatherds. He was cordially welcomed by the goatherds, and Sancho, having, as best he could, put up Rocinante and the ass, drew towards the fragrance that came from some pieces of salted goat simmering in a pot on the fire, and, though he would have liked at once to try if they were ready to be transferred from the pot to the stomach, he refrained from doing so as the goatherds removed them from the fire, and laying sheepskins on the ground, quickly spread their rude table, and with signs of hearty goodwill invited them both to share what they had. Round the skins 6 of the men belonging to the fold seated themselves, having first with rough politeness pressed Don Quixote to take a seat upon a trough, which they placed for him upside down. Don Quixote seated himself, and Sancho remained standing to serve the cup, which was made of horn. Seeing him standing, his master said to him, that you mayst see, Sancho, the good that knight-errantry contains in itself, and how those who fill any office in it are on the high road to be speedily honored and esteemed by the world. I desire that you seat thyself here at my side and in the company of these worthy people, and that you be one with me who am your master and natural lord, and that you eat from my plate and drink from whatever I drink from, for the same may be said of knight-errantry as of love, that it levels all. Great thanks, said Sancho, but I may tell your worship that provided I have enough to eat, I can eat it as well, or better, standing, and by myself, than seated alongside of an emperor. And truly, if the truth is to be told, what I eat in my corner without form or fuss has much more relish for me, evening though it be bread and onions, than the turkeys of those other tables where I am forced to chew slowly, drink little, wipe my mouth every minute, and cannot sneeze or cough if I want or do other things that are the privileges of liberty and solitude. So, Senor, as for these honors which your worship would put upon me as a servant and follower of knight-errantry, exchange them for other things which may be of more use and advantage to me. For these, though I fully acknowledge them as received, I renounce from this moment to the end of the world. For all that, said Don Quixote, you must seat thyself, because him who humbles himself God exalts, and seizing him by the arm he forced him to sit down beside himself. The goatherds did not understand this jargon about squires and knights-errant, and all they did was to eat in silence and stare at their guests, who with great elegance and appetite were stowing away pieces as big as one's fist. The course of meat finished, they spread upon the sheepskins a great heap of parched acorns, and with them they put down a half cheese harder than if it had been made of mortar. All this while the horn was not idle, for it went round so constantly, now full, now empty, like the bucket of a water wheel, that it soon drained one of the 2 wine skins that were in sight. When Don Quixote had quite appeased his appetite, he took up a handful of the acorns, and contemplating them, attentively delivered himself somewhat in this fashion. Happy the age, happy the time, to which the ancients gave the name of golden, not because in that fortunate age the gold so coveted in this hour, iron one was gained without toil, but because they that lived in it knew, not the two words, mine and yours. In that blessed age all things were in common. To win the daily food no labor was required of any save to stretch forth his hand and gather it from the sturdy oaks that stood, generously inviting him with their sweet ripe fruit. The clear streams and running brooks yielded their savory limpid waters in noble abundance. The busy and sagacious bees fixed their republic in the clefts of the rocks and hollows of the trees, offering without usance the plenteous produce of their fragrant toil to every hand. The mighty cork trees, unenforced save of their own courtesy, shed the broad light bark that served at first to roof the houses supported by rude stakes, a protection against the inclemency of heaven alone. Then all was peace, all friendship, all concord. As yet the dull share of the crooked plough had not dared to rend and pierce the tender bowels of our first mother, that without compulsion yielded from every portion of her broad fertile bosom all that could satisfy, sustain, and delight the children that then possessed her. Then was it that the innocent and fair young shepherdess roamed from vale to vale and hill to hill, with flowing locks and no more garments than were needful modestly to cover what modesty seeks and ever sought to hide. Nor were their ornaments like those in use today, set off by Tyrian purple and silk tortured in endless fashions, but the wreathed leaves of the green dock and ivy, with which they went as bravely and becomingly decked as our court dames with all the rare and far-fetched artifices that idle curiosity has taught them. Then the love thoughts of the heart clothed themselves simply and naturally as the heart conceived them, nor sought to commend themselves by forced and rambling verbiage. Fraud, deceit, or malice had then not yet mingled with truth and sincerity. Justice held her ground, undisturbed and unassailed by the efforts of favor and of interest that now so much impair, pervert, and beset her. Arbitrary law had not yet established itself in the mind of the judge, for then there was no cause to judge and no one to be judged. Maidens and modesty, as I have said, wandered at will alone, and unattended, without fear of insult from lawlessness or libertine assault, and if they were undone it was of their own will and pleasure. But now in this hateful age of ours not one is safe, not though some new labyrinth like that of Crete conceal and surround her. Evening there the pestilence of gallantry will make its way to them through chinks or on the air by the zeal of its accursed importunity, and, despite of all seclusion, lead them to ruin. In defense of these, as time advanced and wickedness increased, the order of knights errant was instituted, to defend maidens, to protect widows, and to succor the orphans and the needy. To this order I belong, brother Gothards, to whom I return thanks for the hospitality and kindly welcome ye offer me and my squire. For, though by natural law all living are bound to show favor to knights errant, yet, seeing that without knowing this obligation ye have welcomed and feasted me, it is right that with all the goodwill in my power I should thank you for yours. All this long harangue, which may very well have been spared our knight, delivered, because the acorns they gave him reminded him of the golden age, and the whim seized him to address all this unnecessary argument to the Gothards, who listened to him gaping in amazement, without saying a word in reply. Sancho likewise held his peace and ate acorns and paid repeated visits to the second wine skin, which they had hung up on a cork tree to keep the wine cool. Don Quixote was longer in talking than the supper in finishing, at the end of which one of the Gothards said, "That your worship, Senor, knight errant, may say with more truth that we show you hospitality with ready goodwill. We will give you amusement and pleasure by making one of our comrades sing. He will be here before long, and he is a very intelligent youth and deep in love, and what is more he can read and write and play on the rebeck to perfection." The Gothard had hardly done speaking when the notes of the rebeck reached their ears, and shortly after, the player came up, a very good-looking young man of about 22. His comrades asked him if he had supped, and on his replying that he who had already made the offer said to him, "In that case, Antonio, you mayest as well do us the pleasure of singing a little, that the gentleman, our guest, may see that evening in the mountains and woods there are musicians. We have told him of your accomplishments, and we want you to show them and prove that we say true. So, as you livest, pray sit down and sing that ballad about your love that your uncle the prebendary made you, and that was so much liked in the town." "With all my heart," said the young man, and without waiting for more pressing he seated himself on the trunk of a felled oak, and tuning his rebeck, soon began to sing to these words: Antonio's ballad. "You do love me well, Olalla. Well I know it, evening though love's mute tongues yours eyes have never by their glances told me so, for I know my love you knowest, therefore yours to claim I dare. Once it ceases to be secret, love need never feel despair. True it is, Olalla, sometimes you have all too plainly shown that your heart is brass in hardness and your snowy bosom stone. Yet for all that, in your coyness, and your fickle fits between, hope is there, at least the border of her garment may be seen. Lures to faith are they, those glimpses, and to faith in you I hold. Kindness cannot make it stronger, coldness cannot make it cold. If it be that love is gentle, in your gentleness I see something holding out assurance to the hope of winning you. If it be that in devotion lies a power hearts to move, that which every day I show you, helpful to my suit should prove. Many a time you must have noticed, if to notice you do care, how I go about on Monday, dressed in all my Sunday wear. Love's eyes love to look on brightness, love loves what is gaily dressed. Sunday, Monday, all I care is, you shouldst see me in my best. No account I make of dances, or of strains that pleased you so, keeping you awake from midnight till the cocks began to crow, or of how I roundly swore it, that there's none so fair as you. True it is, but as I said it, by the girls I'm hated now. For Teresa of the hillside, at my praise of you was sore, said, you think you love an angel, it's a monkey you adore, caught by all her glittering trinkets, and her borrowed braids of hair, and a host of made-up beauties, that would love himself and snare. Tea was a lie, and so I told her, and her cousin at the word, gave me his defiance for it, and what followed you have heard. Mine is no high-flown affection, mine no passion par amours, as they call it. What I offer is an honest love and pure cunning cords the Holy Church has, cords of softest silk they be. Put your neck beneath the yoke, dear, mine will follow, you will see, else, and once for all I swear it, by the saint of most renown, if I ever quit the mountains, tea will be in a friar's gown. Here the Gothard brought his song to an end, and though Don Quixote entreated him to sing more, Sancho had no mind that way, being more inclined for sleep than for listening to songs. So said he to his master, your worship will do well to settle at once where you mean to pass the night, for the labor these good men are at all day does not allow them to spend the night in singing. I understand you, Sancho, replied Don Quixote. I perceive clearly that those visits to the wineskin demand compensation in sleep rather than in music. It's sweet to us all, blessed be God, said Sancho. Chapter 12. Of what a Gothard related to those with Don Quixote. Just then another young man, one of those who fetched their provisions from the village, came up and said, do you know what is going on in the village, comrades? How could we know it? Replied one of them. Well, then, you must know, continued the young man, this morning that famous student shepherd called Chrysostom died, and it is rumored that he died of love for that devil of a village girl, the daughter of Guillermo the Rich, she that wanders about the wolds here in the dress of a shepherdess. You mean Marcella, said one. Her I mean, answered the Gothard. and the best of it is he has directed in his will that he is to be buried in the fields like a moor, and at the foot of the rock where the cork tree spring is, because, as the story goes and they say he himself said so, that was the place where he first saw her, and he has also left other directions which the clergy of the village say should not and must not be obeyed because they savor of paganism. To all which his great friend Ambrosio the student, he who, like him, also went dressed as a shepherd, replies that everything must be done without any omission according to the directions left by Chrysostom, and about this the village is all in commotion. However, report says that, after all, what Ambrosio and all the shepherds, his friends, desire will be done, and tomorrow they are coming to bury him with great ceremony, where I said, I am sure it will be something worth seeing. At least I will not fail to go and see it evening if I knew I should not return to the village tomorrow. We will do the same, answered the goatherds, and cast lots to see who must stay to mind the goats of all. You sayest well, Pedro, said one, though there will be no need of taking that trouble, for I will stay behind for all, and don't suppose it is virtue or want of curiosity in me. It is that the splinter that ran into my foot the other day will not let me walk. For all that, we thank you, answered Pedro. Don Quixote asked Pedro to tell him who the dead man was and who the shepherdess, to which Pedro replied that all he knew was that the dead man was a wealthy gentleman belonging to a village in those mountains, who had been a student at Salamanca for many years, at the end of which he returned to his village with the reputation of being very learned and deeply read. Above all, they said, he was learned in the science of the stars and of what went on over there in the heavens and the sun and the moon, for he told us of the criss of the sun and moon to exact time. Eclipse it is called, friend, not criss, the darkening of those two luminaries, said Don Quixote. But Pedro, not troubling himself with trifles, went on with his story, saying, also he foretold when the year was going to be one of abundance or estility. Sterility, you mean, said Don Quixote. Sterility or estility, answered Pedro, it is all the same in the end, and I can tell you that by this his father and friends who believed him grew very rich because they did as he advised them, bidding them sow barley this year, not wheat. This year you may sow pulse and not barley. The next there will be a full oil crop, and the 3 following not a drop will be got. That science is called astrology, said Don Quixote. I do not know what it is called, replied Pedro, but I know that he knew all this and more besides. But, to make an end, not many months had passed after he returned from Salamanca, when one day he appeared dressed as a shepherd with his crook and sheepskin, having put off the long gown he wore as a scholar, and at the same time his great friend Ambrosio by name, who had been his companion in his studies, took to the shepherd's dress with him. I forgot to say that Chrysostom, who is dead, was a great man for writing verses, so much so that he made carols for Christmas Eve, and plays for Corpus Christi, which the young men of our village acted, and all said they were excellent. When the villagers saw the 2 scholars so unexpectedly appearing in shepherd's dress, they were lost in wonder, and could not guess what had led them to make so extraordinary a change. About this time the father of our Chrysostom died, and he was left heir to a large amount of property in chattels as well as in land, no small number of cattle and sheep, and a large sum of money, of all of which the young man was left dissolute owner, and truly he was deserving of it all, for he was a very good comrade and kind-hearted, and a friend of worthy folk, and had a countenance like a benediction. Soon it came to be known that he had changed his dress with no other object than to wander about these wastes after that shepherdess Marcella, our lad, mentioned a while ago, with whom the deceased Chrysostom had fallen in love. And I must tell you now, for it is well you should know it, who this girl is. Perhaps an evening without any perhaps you will not have heard anything like it all the days of your life, though you should live more years than Sarna. Say, Sarah, said Don Quixote, unable to endure the Gothard's confusion of words. The Sarna lives long enough, answered Pedro, and if, Senor, you must go finding fault with words at every step, we shall not make an end of it this 12 a month. Pardon me, friend, said Don Quixote, but as there is such a difference between Sarna and Sarah, I told you of it. However, you have answered very rightly, for Sarna lives longer than Sarah. So continue your story, and I will not object any more to anything. I say then, my dear sir, said the Gothard, that in our village there was a farmer evening richer than the father of Chrysostom, who was named Guillermo, and upon whom God bestowed, over and above great wealth, a daughter at whose birth her mother died. The most respected woman there was in this neighborhood. I fancy I can see her now with that countenance which had the sun on one side and the moon on the other, and moreover active and kind to the poor, for which I trust that at the present moment her soul is in bliss with God in the other world. Her husband Guillermo died of grief at the death of so good a wife, leaving his daughter Marcella, a child and rich, to the care of an uncle of hers, a priest and prebendary in our village. The girl grew up with such beauty that it reminded us of her mother's, which was very great, and yet it was thought that the daughters would exceed it, and so when she reached the age of 14 to 15 years nobody beheld her but blessed God that had made her so beautiful, and the greater number were in love with her. Past redemption, her uncle kept her in great seclusion and retirement, but for all that the fame of her great beauty spread so that, as well for it as for her great wealth, her uncle was asked, solicited, and importuned to give her in marriage not only by those of our town but of those many leagues round, and by the persons of highest quality in them. But he, being a good Christian man, though he desired to give her in marriage at once, seeing her to be old enough, was unwilling to do so without her consent, not that he had any eye to the gain and profit which the custody of the girl's property brought him while he put off her marriage, and faith. This was said in praise of the good priest in more than one set in the town, for I would have you know, Sir Errant, that in these little villages everything is talked about and everything is carped at, and rest assured, as I am, that the priest must be over and above good who forces his parishioners to speak well of him, especially in villages. That is the truth, said Don Quixote. But go on, for the story is very good, and you, good Pedro, tell it with very good grace. May that of the Lord not be wanting to me, said Pedro. That is the one to have. To proceed, you must know that though the uncle put before his niece and described to her the qualities of each one in particular of the many who had asked her in marriage, begging her to marry and make a choice according to her own taste, she never gave any other answer than that she had no desire to marry just yet, and that being so young she did not think herself fit to bear the burden of matrimony. At these, to all appearance, reasonable excuses that she made, her uncle ceased to urge her, and waited till she was somewhat more advanced in age and could mate herself to her own liking. For, said he, and he said quite right, parents are not to settle children in life against their will, but when one least looked for it, lo and behold, one day the demure Marcella makes her appearance turn shepherdess, and in spite of her uncle and all those of the town that strove to dissuade her, took to going afield with the other shepherd lasses of the village, and tending her own flock. And so, since she appeared in public, and her beauty came to be seen openly, I could not well tell you how many rich youths, gentlemen and peasants have adopted the costume of Chrysostom, and go about these fields making love to her. One of these, as has been already said, was our deceased friend, of whom they say that he did not love but adore her. But you must not suppose, because Marcella chose a life of such liberty and independence, and of so little or rather no retirement, that she has given any occasion, or evening the semblance of one, for disparagement of her purity and modesty. On the contrary, such and so great is the vigilance with which she watches over her honor, that of all those that court and woo her not one has boasted, or can with truth boast, that she has given him any hope however small of obtaining his desire. For, although she does not avoid or shun the society and conversation of the shepherds, and treats them courteously and kindly, should any one of them come to declare his intention to her, though it be one as proper and holy as that of matrimony, she flings him from her like a catapult. And with this kind of disposition she does more harm in this country than if the plague had got into it, for her affability and her beauty draw on the hearts of those that associate with her to love her and to court her, but her scorn and her frankness bring them to the brink of despair, and so they know not what to say save to proclaim her aloud cruel and hard-hearted, and other names of the same sort which well describe the nature of her character. And if you should remain here any time, Senner, you would hear these hills and valleys resounding with the laments of the rejected ones who pursue her. Not far from this there is a spot where there are a couple of dozen of tall beeches, and there is not one of them but has carved and written on its smooth bark the name of Marcella, and above some a crown carved on the same tree, as though her lover would say more plainly that Marcella wore and deserved that of all human beauty. Here one shepherd is sighing, there another is lamenting. Their love songs are heard, here despairing elegies. One will pass all the hours of the night seated at the foot of some oak or rock, and there, without having closed his weeping eyes, the sun finds him in the morning bemused and bereft of sense, and another without relief or respite to his sighs, stretched on the burning sand in the full heat of the sultry summer noontide, makes his appeal to the compassionate heavens, and over one and the other, over these and all, the beautiful Marcella triumphs free and careless, and all of us that know her are waiting to see what her pride will come to, and who is to be the happy man that will succeed in taming in nature so formidable and gaining possession of a beauty so supreme. All that I have told you being such well-established truth, I am persuaded that what they say of the cause of Chrysostom's death, as our lad told us, is the same. And so I advise you, Senner, fail not to be present to tomorrow at his burial, which will be well worth seeing, for Chrysostom had many friends, and it is not half a league from this place to where he directed he should be buried. I will make a point of it, said Don Quixote, and I thank you for the pleasure you have given me by relating so interesting a tale. Oh, said the Goatherd, I do not know evening the half of what has happened to the lovers of Marcella, but perhaps to-morrow we may fall in with some shepherd on the road who can tell us. And now it will be well for you to go and sleep under cover, for the night air may hurt your wound, though with the remedy I have applied to you there is no fear of an untoward result. Sancho Panza, who was wishing the Goatherd's loquacity at the devil, on his part begged his master to go into Pedro's hut to sleep. He did so, and passed all the rest of the night in thinking of his lady Dulcinea, in imitation of the lovers of Marcella.